They told you what you were, and then they repeated it, and every time they did, your brain reinforced the narrative, neurons firing in the same direction, until those neural pathways became highways, until that story became a prison, and you forgot the truth. They didn't have to lie to you. They just had to tell you the same thing enough times with enough authority. That's all it takes to rewrite memory. And once your memory is altered, your present behavior becomes automatic. You avoid risks because you remember failing. You silence yourself because you remember embarrassing moments. You stay small because you remember that speaking up got you punished. But were those memories full truths? Or partial truths, viewed through a lens of fear, shame, or suggestion? Generalio. Because here's what they won't tell you. Memories are reconstructed every time you recall them. They aren't fixed. Each time you access a memory, you reshape it slightly, based on your current mood, your environment, your self-image. And they know this. They use it. Watch how easily your memory can be manipulated. A headline reframes an event you lived through. Suddenly, your personal experience feels invalid. A friend tells a different version of a shared memory, and you doubt your own. A therapist, a teacher, a parent repeats an interpretation of your past until you adopt it as fact. You stop trusting your instincts. You start doubting what you felt. You rewrite your inner timeline to match someone else's comfort. And when that happens, you become easier to control. Because now you'll defend a version of your past that keeps you quiet, keeps you afraid, keeps you in line. And you won't even know you're doing it, because it feels like your story. That's the most dangerous kind of programming, the kind you call identity. If they can get you to feel shame about your past, they can keep you small. If they can get you to feel guilt, they can get you to obey. If they can get you to relabel your truth as overreaction, they can get you to betray yourself. And it doesn't require force, just subtle corrections. A raised eyebrow, a "that's not how I remember it," a soft condescending chuckle. A story told at your expense again and again, until you laugh with them, because it's easier than defending the part of you that still aches. But you don't have to keep carrying a memory that doesn't belong to you. You can start to question the narrative. You can ask, is this how it really happened, or is this the version that made everyone else more comfortable? You can ask, what parts of me were erased in this retelling? What parts were exaggerated? Whose benefit does this version serve? And suddenly, your past opens up. You remember moments you buried, not because you forgot, but because someone convinced you they didn't matter. You remember feelings that were dismissed, not because they were false, but because they were inconvenient. You begin to rebuild your memory not as a weapon against yourself, but as a sanctuary of self-understanding. This isn't about changing history. It's about reclaiming it. You start to realize, I wasn't too sensitive. I was surrounded by people who weren't safe enough to feel. I wasn't too dramatic. I was desperate to be heard in a room that punished volume. I wasn't too much. I was just more than they knew how to hold. That's what happens when you take memory back into your own hands. You heal the inner timeline. You rewrite the footnotes scribbled by other people's discomfort. And in doing so, you start to see your present self differently. Because memory isn't just about the past. It's the foundation of your now. Change the story of who you were, and everything shifts. You stand taller, you speak clearer, you choose differently, because you're no longer being led by a ghost-written script. You're moving from truth, from clarity, from you. They wanted you to forget that, because when you remember what was taken, you start taking it back. Your time, your power, your voice. You begin to realize your memory was never the weapon, the distortion was, and now the story is yours to tell. Shame doesn't announce itself. It doesn't scream. It doesn't march into your life and demand your attention. It whispers. It lingers. It waits. It crawls into the quiet spaces of your mind and rewrites the way you see yourself. And by the time you realize it's there, you've already accepted its voice as your own. You don't even call it shame. You call it being realistic. You call it self-awareness. You call it knowing your place. But it's none of those things. It's a script. One you were handed a long time ago when you were too young to question it, too small to push back and too smart to risk rejection. Because shame is more than just a feeling. It's a tool. It's how they keep you in line without raising their voice. It's how they get you to play small without touching a chain. It's the invisible leash you carry inside your chest, tightening every time you dare to step beyond the version of yourself you were told was acceptable. At first, it looks like control. A teacher who rolls their eyes when you speak too loudly. A parent who punishes your tears. A friend who laughs when you share your dreams. Each moment seems small, but they add up, and you begin to learn that the world doesn't just judge your actions, it judges you. Not what you did, who you are. And that's how the script begins. It tells you that you're not just someone who made a mistake. You are the mistake. You're not just someone who failed, you are a failure. You're not just someone who's emotional, you're too much. And once you believe that, they don't need to say anything else. You'll silence yourself, you'll hold back, you'll apologize for existing before anyone even asks you to. Shame makes you complicit in your own diminishment. Because shame changes your posture. It changes the way you enter rooms, the way you speak, the way you think. It teaches you to edit yourself before you've even been seen. It trains you to assume rejection, to anticipate judgment, to punish yourself so no one else has to. It becomes your inner monologue. Why did I say that? They probably think I'm annoying. Why can't I just be normal? I should have known better. I always ruin things. That voice? It doesn't come from nowhere. It's the accumulated echo of 1,000 subtle corrections. It's not the content of your story, it's the glue, the emotion that holds their narrative about you in place. Because without shame, their story can't stick. Without shame, their labels fall apart. Without shame, you might actually believe you're allowed to grow, to change, to try, to speak, to be. And that's dangerous. To them. Because once you no longer carry shame, you start asking questions. Why did I ever believe I was too much? Who taught me to be embarrassed by my needs? What parts of myself did I disown to be acceptable? And in those questions, you begin to unravel the story. You begin to see that shame was never yours. It was projected onto you by someone who couldn't face their own, by systems that only function when people forget their worth, by voices that needed you to shrink so they could feel bigger, and still, because you're human, you internalized it. Because at some point, belonging felt more important than truth. You thought, if I can just be good enough, small enough, quiet enough, maybe I'll be safe. But shame doesn't keep you safe, it keeps you stuck. And what's worse, it makes the cage feel like home. It tells you that your discomfort is your fault, that your limitations are natural, that your pain is just the cost of being who you are. But what if your pain isn't evidence of your failure? What if it's proof of your misidentification? You were never broken, you were buried, under years of unworthiness disguised as humility, under rules that praised your silence and punished your truth, under systems that called your shame a virtue, modesty, politeness, deference. They called it maturity, but it was really erasure, a quiet kind, the kind that asks you to smile while you disappear. And if you do that long enough, shame becomes the only identity that feels familiar. So when someone offers you freedom, you flinch, you turn it down, you sabotage it, not because you don't want it, but because part of you believes you don't deserve it. That's what shame does. It doesn't just live in your thoughts, it lives in your reflexes. When you hesitate to take up space, that's shame. When you feel guilt for resting, that's shame. When you think you have to earn your worth every day, that's shame. But here's the truth that breaks it apart. Shame is a script. And all scripts can be rewritten. You don't have to earn your way out of shame. You only have to stop agreeing with it. That doesn't mean pretending it's not there. That means recognizing it when it shows up. When that voice whispers, "You're not enough," you don't have to fight it. You just have to say, "That's not mine." When it says, "Who do you think you are?" you respond, "Exactly who I've always been before I was told to forget." Because shame loses its grip the moment you stop calling it truth. You start to remember the moments before the script, before you were told to behave, to hide, to dim. You remember the wildness in your laughter, the unapologetic joy, the curiosity that wasn't yet restrained, the voice that sang without shrinking. That version of you is not gone. It's waiting. Underneath the shame, beneath the roles, beyond the fear. And every time you choose to show up anyway, every time you speak when your throat tightens, every time you rest without apology, every time you let yourself be seen, even when the old voice says, "Don't," you're rewriting the script, not with perfection, with presence. You are not here to carry a story that was never yours. You're here to remember, and in remembering, you return. You wake up each day and put it on without thinking, the version of yourself you've learned to be, the one that fits the rooms you walk into, the one that makes others comfortable, the one that seems reliable, successful, likable, composed. You wear it like skin even when it chafes. You carry it like armor even when it gets heavy, and after a while it becomes automatic, natural, expected. But beneath all of that polish, beneath all of that performance, there's a quiet ache that never fully leaves you. It's the part of you that knows, the part that remembers this identity, this collection of traits, titles, labels, wasn't chosen, it was assigned. Not in a single moment, but gradually, subtly, layer by layer, until it hardened around you like a shell, beautiful on the outside, but impossible to breathe inside. This is the cage, and the bars are made of praise, because that's how it begins, not with punishment, but with reward. You're praised for being the responsible one, the calm one, the funny one, the high achiever, the peacekeeper. You're told who you are before you've had the chance to ask. And at first it feels good. Who wouldn't want to be loved for something? But what they don't tell you is that the love often comes with conditions. Be this version of yourself, or lose connection. And so you adapt. You streamline. You specialize. You cut off the parts of you that don't match the mask. The anger, the messiness, the wildness, the softness, the need. You tuck them away in the dark corners of your psyche where they won't disturb the narrative others have built for you, and they call that maturity. But it's not maturity. It's containment. And the longer you live inside that identity, the more you forget that it's a performance. You call it just how I am, you defend it, you protect it, you build your life around it. But if you listen closely, you'll hear the creak of the hinges. You'll feel the weight of what you've lost. Because an identity built by others is never a home. It's a holding cell. It doesn't expand. It doesn't evolve. It demands consistency at the cost of truth. So when you want to grow, to explore, to change, the cage rattles. And the voice inside you says, "You can't do that. That's not who you are." But who decided? Who wrote the rule that says, "You're the strong one, so you can't be soft"? The rule that says you're the quiet one, so you can't speak boldly. The rule that says you're the smart one, so you can't be confused, messy, emotional. Those weren't your rules. Those were survival strategies. You became what the world needed you to be so you could belong. But now, what you need is something different. Now you need room. Room to ask, who am I without the roles? Without the performance, without the stories that were handed to me before I even had a voice. That question is terrifying, because for most of your life, your identity gave you safety. It gave you a place in the world, a sense of certainty, even if it came at the cost of your authenticity. So the idea of letting it go, even partially, can feel like annihilation, like death. But what if it's not the death of you, but the rebirth? Because the truth is, you're not meant to be a static character in a script you didn't write. You're not meant to play the same role forever. just because it's the one people applauded the loudest. You are allowed to evolve. You are allowed to contradict your past. You are allowed to outgrow your own identity, because identity should be a doorway, not a destination. But too many of us build our entire lives on top of a version of ourselves that was never fully true to begin with. We become attached to how others see us, and terrified of what might happen if they see something else. So we hide. We hide our age because it doesn't fit the good one. We hide our tenderness because it doesn't fit the strong one. We hide our questions because it doesn't fit the smart one. We hide our needs because it doesn't fit the independent one. And every time we hide, we reinforce the bars. Every time we smile when we want to scream. Every time we say I'm fine when we're breaking. Every time we nod along just to keep the peace. We trade our truth for approval. And they call it identity. But here's the thing. The real you was never meant to be reduced to a label. You are not an archetype. You are not a brand. You are not a single story. You are a symphony. You are rage and tenderness. You are brilliance and confusion. You are sacred and messy and wild and soft and fierce. You are not either/or. You are and. And the moment you remember that, the cage begins to crack. You start allowing yourself to speak differently, to feel differently, to respond in ways that don't match who you've been told you are. And at first, it's disorienting. The people around you may not understand. They might say, "You've changed." But what they really mean is, you're no longer manageable. You're no longer sticking to the script. And that's a good thing. Because the people who only love you for your role will never really loving you. And now you're free to find the ones who can. Not just the ones who applaud your mask, the ones who witness your truth and stay. But more importantly than anyone else, you begin to stay with yourself. You begin to breathe deeper, to move differently, to take up space in your own life without apologizing, not because you've found a new identity, but because you've stopped needing one. You've remembered that you were always more than the story, and now you're finally ready to live like it. You learned it young. That smile they wanted, the one that made adults soften, the one that earned praise, the one that turned tension into approval. It wasn't just an expression, it was currency. It bought you safety. It bought you peace. It bought you a little more room to breathe in a world that always seemed a little too eager to correct you. So you kept using it, even when you didn't feel like smiling, even when your stomach was in knots, when your throat burned with words you didn't say, when your hands curled into fists behind your back, you smiled. Not because you were happy, but because it worked. Because it gave you what every human being is wired to crave: belonging. But what happens when the price of belonging is your truth? What happens when the smile becomes a muzzle? Because that's what no one told you, that your smile could become your prison. That the more you used it to earn approval, the more you lost your voice. Not all at once, piece by piece, expression by expression, until eventually the people around you forgot to ask how you really felt, because you trained them not to. And even worse, you trained yourself not to ask. You became fluent in the unspoken rules. Smile and no one will question you. Smile and they'll let you stay. Smile and maybe they'll love you. And so you smiled at the joke that stung, at the comment that dismissed you, at the lie you didn't want to tell but did anyway, because the truth felt too risky. You convinced yourself it was kindness, grace, emotional intelligence, social awareness, but deep down you knew it was something else. It was survival, because approval feels like air when you've spent your life holding your breath. And somewhere along the way, the approval stopped being a bonus and became a necessity. That's when the leash formed. Not physical, not visible, but psychological, internal. You could feel it in your chest when you considered saying no, in your throat when you wanted to express anger, in your spine when you felt the pull to walk away from something but stayed docile, because smiling was easier than explaining. That's the leash, the internalized expectation that your value comes from your agreeableness, not your truth, not your boundaries, not your fire, your ability to be pleasant, palatable, polite. And it's no accident. You were raised in systems that rewarded submission disguised as sweetness. You were taught that your worth is measured by how comfortable you make others feel, that disruption is disrespect, that silence is strength, that the more invisible your needs are, the more lovable you'll become. But lovable to who? To people who never learned to love someone fully expressed, to systems that benefit from your obedience, to a world that prefers your smile to your substance? It's not your fault. You were taught to prioritize connection. You were taught to smooth the edges. You were taught that saying I'm fine is better than being honest, because honesty makes people uncomfortable. And somewhere along the way, discomfort became the enemy. But here's the thing they never told you. Discomfort is the birthplace of authenticity. Your truth will not always make people comfortable. Your boundaries will not always be met with applause. Your no will not always be seen as noble. But none of that means you're wrong. It means you're real. And real is what the smile was trained to hide. Because real doesn't always smile. Real furrows its brow. It cries. It shakes. It speaks in messy sentences. It doesn't always know the right thing to say. It stutters. It stops mid-thought. It screams sometimes. It stays silent other times, not because it's scared, but because it's processing. Real doesn't smile on command. It smiles when it means it. And reclaiming that smile, bringing it back to its rightful place as an expression instead of a submission, is one of the most radical things you can do. Because every time you smile to maintain peace, you don't feel. You abandon a part of yourself, and when you do it enough times, you start to forget what authenticity even feels like. You laugh when you're angry. You agree when you're screaming inside. You nod when your heart is saying, "No, please stop." That's not harmony, that's self-betrayal. And the leash tightens every time you do it. But the leash doesn't have to stay. It loosens the moment you pause and ask, why am I smiling right now? Is it because I'm truly feeling this moment? Or because I'm afraid of what will happen if I don't? And that awareness, that tiny, courageous pause, cracks the program open. You start noticing how often you soften your tone to avoid seeming difficult, noticing how you censor your opinions when they go against the grain, noticing how your body feels tense even when your face says everything's great. And when you notice, you get to choose. You get to speak with your whole self, not just the parts that earn applause. You get to let your face reflect your heart, not your training. That might mean someone feels awkward. That might mean a relationship changes. That might mean you're no longer the easy one. But you weren't born to be easy. You were born to be true. And the people who can meet you in that truth, the ones who see you and stay, those are the people who love the real you. Not the smile, not the performance, not the script. You. And more importantly, you begin to love you. The version of you that says no with a calm voice. The version that says I'm hurt without wrapping it in a joke. The version that doesn't force a grin when everything inside you is aching. That's where freedom lives. Not in becoming harder, not in never smiling again, but in choosing when the smile is yours, and when it's just the leash in disguise. You've smiled through too much already. It's time to let your face match your fire, your heart, your truth, not for rebellion, but for reclamation. Because you don't owe the world your pleasantness, you owe yourself your presence. Niceness is praised, it's rewarded, it's promoted like a virtue, woven into the fabric of how you're expected to show up in the world. Be nice, be pleasant, be agreeable. Don't cause trouble, don't stir the pot, don't speak too loudly, too honestly, too passionately. But here's the thing you were never told. Niceness and kindness are not the same. One is a performance, the other is a principle. One is about perception, the other is about presence. And too often, the world has trained you to confuse the two. Niceness is polished, rehearsed. It knows how to read the room, it wears a smile even when it's gritting its teeth. It softens truths that should never have been softened. It stays quiet when its insides are on fire. Because niceness isn't about connection, it's about control. And the one being controlled is you. You've been told that niceness is noble, that being nice means being good, that it means being well-liked, well-mannered, easy to work with, easy to love. But what if that's the trap? What if being nice is just another way to be compliant? Because the truth is, fake kindness, the kind that asks you to abandon your needs, your boundaries, your fire, isn't kindness at all. It's self-erasure. It's manipulation in a prettier outfit. Not always by others, sometimes by yourself. You've learned to use niceness as armor, as a strategy. You say yes when you mean no, because saying no would make someone uncomfortable. You offer help even when you're depleted, because you're afraid of being seen as selfish. You sugarcoat your truth until it's unrecognizable because you were taught that honesty without gentleness is cruelty. But who told you that? And who benefits from it? Because if you're always nice, always agreeable, always accommodating, then you're predictable, manageable, safe. And when you're safe, others don't have to examine their own behavior. They don't have to change. They don't have to be uncomfortable. They get to stay exactly where they are, even if where they are is hurting you. That's how niceness becomes the front line of control. Because if they can get you to believe that your discomfort is less important than their approval, they don't have to lift a finger to keep you small. You'll do it for them. You'll silence yourself. You'll smile while you're bleeding. You'll offer grace to those who never earned it. And the most insidious part, you'll call it love. It's appeasement, and appeasement always leads to resentment, because somewhere deep inside, you know the difference. You know when you're being genuine, and when you're performing, you feel it in the exhaustion after a conversation where you didn't say what you meant. In the tension in your jaw after you agreed to something you didn't want to do. In the hollow ache in your chest when someone thanks you for being so understanding but never once asked what you needed. You tell yourself you're just being nice, but what you're really being is absent from yourself. You're stepping over your truth to keep the peace. But peace without authenticity is a lie. It's not peace. It's quiet control. And control doesn't always come with yelling. Sometimes it comes with a compliment, a gentle tone, a request disguised as care, a soft demand wrapped in the language of just trying to help. And when you push back, even a little, you're the one who's suddenly overreacting. Because niceness is a game of optics. As long as everything looks fine, the truth doesn't matter. You've seen it happen. In families where harm is swept under the rug in the name of keeping things pleasant. In workplaces where abuse is excused because the boss means well. In relationships where manipulation is masked with affection, and the words, "I'm only saying this because I care," precede 1,000 tiny cuts. You've been in rooms where everyone smiles and no one is safe. Because the truth is, niceness can be a shield for cruelty. It creates an environment where confrontation is seen as aggression, where setting boundaries is seen as betrayal, where saying, "that hurt me," is met with, "why are you being so negative?" And you've learned, often the hard way, that people would rather you be nice than be honest. They'd rather you be agreeable than be alive. But your aliveness is not up for negotiation. Because real kindness isn't soft for the sake of softness. Real kindness is rooted in courage. It's honest. It's direct. It holds space and holds accountable. Kindness says, "I respect you enough to tell you the truth." Niceness says, "I fear you enough to protect your comfort at the cost of my own, and you deserve more than a life built around the fears of others. You deserve to speak plainly, to say no without apology, to stop smiling when you're hurting, to stop padding your truth so it doesn't bruise someone's ego. You deserve to live without the leash of approval, because niceness has become your leash. You feel it in how quickly you apologize for things that aren't your fault, in how you replay every interaction, worried that you seemed rude for being direct, in how you minimize your needs, your dreams, your pain, just to avoid being too much. But here's the truth, you're allowed to be too much. You're allowed to want clarity. You're allowed to speak plainly. You're allowed to make people uncomfortable when you're being honest. Because discomfort is where growth happens, and the people who love you will grow with you. The ones who only loved your niceness will fall away. Let them, because what's left will be real, not performative, not polite, but powerful. And in that power you'll find something you never had when you were busy being nice: respect from others. But more importantly, from yourself. You were taught to light up when they praised you, to feel seen, to feel valued, to feel worthy. Because praise felt like love, approval felt like safety, and every compliment handed to you, whether for your intelligence, your beauty, your discipline, your kindness, was a golden thread tying your sense of self to someone else's expectations. But there's a shadow to praise, a cost hidden beneath the sugar, because what begins as recognition slowly becomes responsibility, and that responsibility starts to shape you. It tells you who you're supposed to be, how you're supposed to act, what version of you they find acceptable, admirable, lovable, and without realizing it, you begin to perform the compliment. You begin to owe it. They tell you you're so mature for your age, and suddenly there's no room for you to cry, no space to be messy, no permission to be young. They tell you you're so strong, and now you can't show weakness, can't ask for help, can't say, I'm overwhelmed. They tell you you're always so calm, and you start swallowing your rage, your fear, your truth, just to protect the illusion they admire. That's the debt. Because every time you receive praise without space for complexity, it becomes a standard, a silent contract, one you never agreed to but feel compelled to uphold, because to break that image feels like betrayal. And no one wants to be the disappointment. So you smile through the pressure, you carry it like it's pride, you convince yourself it's who you are, but deep down, you're exhausted. Because compliments can be cages. Gilded, polished, beautiful, but cages nonetheless. Especially when you start making decisions not from your truth, but from your image. You don't speak your needs because you're so easygoing. You don't take a break because you're so reliable. You don't admit you're scared because you're so fearless. You start protecting the compliment instead of protecting yourself. And that's where the control begins. It's not just about what they say to you, it's about what you start saying to yourself. I can't quit now, people are counting on me. I can't slow down, this is who I am. I can't change, they'll think I've failed. But who are you really living for? Because somewhere along the line, the compliment stopped being about appreciation and started being about performance. And you became the performer, even when the stage was killing you. That's the trick of dark psychology. It doesn't need to criticize you to control you. It only needs to praise you in the right places. And you'll cage yourself, you'll regulate your behavior, you'll filter your emotions, you'll edit your truth, because the praise felt too good to lose, because approval felt like a drug you didn't know you were addicted to, because being seen as good started to matter more than being whole. And the more you comply with the compliment, the more distant your true self becomes, not because it's gone, but because it's buried. Buried under all the roles you thought you had to maintain. You become afraid of what happens when you stop playing your part. Will they still love you if you say no? If you're not strong? If you cry? If you let the mask drop? You wonder who will leave. But the real question is, who will stay? Because the ones who stay when you're no longer performing, those are your people. And more importantly, you are your person again. Because you're no longer beholden to the image they constructed for you. You're no longer carrying the weight of other people's expectations disguised as affection. You're no longer in debt, because praise should never feel like pressure. And recognition should never cost you your reality, but if it does, then it wasn't love. It was conditioning. You don't need to keep repaying the compliments that were never invitations. They were instructions. You don't have to keep being the nice one, the wise one, the quiet one, the one who always keeps it together. You're allowed to be messy, contradictory, honest, real. You're allowed to shatter the image. Because you are not here to be admired. You are here to be authentic. And sometimes authenticity will disappoint the people who only loved your highlight reel. Let them be disappointed, because their disappointment is not your failure, it's their discomfort with your wholeness. And wholeness is what you're reclaiming? You're reclaiming the version of you that doesn't contort to fit a compliment. You're reclaiming the voice that doesn't quiet itself to seem agreeable. You're reclaiming the freedom to be more than the roles you've been rewarded for. That's what happens when you stop performing the praise. You start living from the inside out. And for the first time in a long time, you breathe. Not for applause, not for approval, not to uphold the image, but for you. Because the real you was never the compliment. The real you was the one buried underneath, waiting for permission to be seen, not just appreciated. And now you don't need the permission anymore. You've already given it to yourself. Guilt doesn't slam into you. It creeps. It creeps in the quiet. In the hesitation before you say what you really mean. In the tension you feel before making a choice that honors yourself. It doesn't need to shout. It just needs to linger, low and constant, like background noise you stop noticing but never stop feeling. And it works. Because guilt isn't just an emotion. It's a system. A system built to regulate you, to shape you, to guide you away from your own instincts and into the hands of others' agendas. It's the invisible string the puppet master uses to move your limbs without touching you. You say yes when you mean no. You apologize when you've done nothing wrong. You explain yourself endlessly to people who were never listening. And you think you're being kind or thoughtful or emotionally mature. But what if you're just being controlled? Because guilt has a way of dressing itself up as virtue. You were taught that feeling bad means you're a good person, that if something hurts, it's because you're growing, that if you're uncomfortable, it must be because you've crossed some moral line. But guilt doesn't always show up when you've done something wrong. Sometimes it shows up when you finally start doing something right, when you draw a boundary, when you protect your time, when you stop letting someone else define your worth. That's when guilt pounces. Not because you've caused harm, but because you've disrupted a pattern. And in systems of control, disrupting the pattern is the threat. So they train you early. They train you with disappointed looks, with heavy sighs, with sentences that start with, "After all I've done for you," with reminders of how much they've sacrificed, how much they've suffered, how much you owe them. And suddenly your autonomy becomes a betrayal. Suddenly your choices come with consequences that aren't physical, but emotional. You're made to feel like the villain just for trying to be your own person. That's not love. That's leverage. And guilt is the currency. Because once they've taught you to associate your needs with someone else's pain, they don't have to stop you from speaking. You'll stop yourself. You'll silence your truth just to keep the peace. You'll bend over backwards just to avoid the look on their face. You'll stay in rooms, relationships, patterns that hurt you, not because you want to, but because leaving would mean hurting someone else. But who's hurting you? That question rarely gets asked. Because guilt is a master of misdirection. It doesn't point at the system. It points at you. It whispers, "You're being selfish. You're too sensitive. You should be grateful. You're making things harder than they need to be." And the most dangerous part? You believe it. Because guilt doesn't always come from others. Once internalized, it becomes your own inner warden. You wake up to its voice before your feet hit the floor. You feel it when you rest, when you say no, when you succeed, when you shine. Because somewhere deep inside you've confused guilt with morality, But morality without context becomes manipulation. You're not a bad person for choosing yourself. You're not a bad person for saying, "This doesn't work for me anymore." You're not a bad person for refusing to carry what someone else placed on your back. You're a person who's learning to return to yourself. And the closer you get to that center, the louder guilt becomes. Because it was never meant to disappear easily. Guilt is sticky. It's stubborn. It will twist your words, your memories, your sense of worth. It will convince you that peace must always come at your expense. But here's the truth they never wanted you to realize. You can feel guilty and still be right. You can feel guilty and still choose yourself. Still walk away. Still speak up. Still grow. Because guilt is not proof that you've done something wrong. Sometimes it's just proof that you've stepped out of the role they assigned you. And they don't want to admit that role was never fair to begin with. So they weaponize guilt to keep you in place. Parents do it, partners do it, employers do it, systems do it, and then eventually you do it to yourself. That's the final stage of control, when the puppet master no longer has to pull the strings. You've tied them to your own wrists, and you start regulating your joy, your voice, your dreams, because someone, somewhere, once convinced you that your happiness comes at someone else's expense. But does it? Does your light actually hurt them, or does it just expose the parts of them that were never willing to shine? Does your boundary actually harm them, or does it just take away their access to what they were never entitled to? These are questions guilt hopes you'll never ask. Because once you do, the illusion falls apart. You see the pattern, you name the manipulation, you break the contract. And guilt can no longer guide you. Not because it disappears, but because you no longer take its voice at face value. You learn to sit with the sensation without surrendering to it, to feel the discomfort without letting it dictate your direction, to say, yes, guilt is here, and I'm choosing myself anyway. That's power. That's freedom. That's when the strings snap. Because you're no longer the puppet dancing for approval. You're the one holding your own truth, steady, firm, unshaken. And yes, some people will not like that. Some will guilt you harder. Push the narrative, tell you you've changed. Let them. Let them call your sovereignty selfish. Because their disapproval is not your guide. Your clarity is. And the more you trust it, the quieter guilt becomes. Not because it leaves forever, but because it no longer leads. You do. Finally. You've said sorry more times than you can count. Sorry when you walk into a room. Sorry when you speak too long. Sorry when you bump into someone who wasn't even looking. Sorry when you cry when you need, when you ask for space, when you take up space. You've learned to apologize not just for what you do, but for who you are. It happens subtly at first. You learn that speaking too much makes people shift uncomfortably, that needing clarity gets labeled as too sensitive, that having boundaries makes you difficult. You learn that your power unsettles people, that your fullness, your voice, your presence, your fire, doesn't always fit neatly into the spaces you were allowed to occupy. So you adapt, you shrink, not out of weakness, but out of instinct, out of survival, because somewhere along the way the world taught you a dangerous equation. Your visibility, someone else's discomfort, and discomfort equals rejection, and rejection feels like death. So you find ways to disappear. You soften your tone. You over-explain your intentions. You second-guess your every decision. You twist yourself into versions of yourself that feel more acceptable, more digestible, more nice. And when the discomfort creeps in, when you feel too big, too loud, too real, you reach for the easiest salve you know. Apology. I am sorry. But what are you actually apologizing for? For existing in a way they didn't expect, for shining when they needed you to stay dim, for being honest when they only wanted harmony? Because you're not just apologizing for missteps, you're apologizing for being. And that's the cost of social programming. From the time you were young, you were trained to self-monitor, to analyze the room before you spoke, to make sure your emotions didn't make things uncomfortable, to avoid being dramatic, to be agreeable, to make it easy for others to like you, especially if you were praised for being mature, especially if you were punished for being too much. And so your nervous system learned, play small, stay safe, because big energy got called rude, because sadness was inconvenient, because asking for more made people sigh, because boldness got you labeled. So now even in adulthood you carry that programming like a reflex. You apologize before you even know what for. You soften your voice before it even has the chance to rise. You prepare for rejection before you're even seen. That's not humility. That's trauma. Because you weren't born apologizing. You were born expansive. You were born with lungs that screamed without permission, with a voice that didn't ask for approval, with desires that reached for everything. You learned to apologize. You learned it from systems that wanted you obedient, from families that needed you manageable, from classrooms that punished your questions, from workplaces that only rewarded your compliance. And you started to believe that being too much was the problem, when in reality their containers were just too small. But instead of questioning the container, you turned on yourself. You internalized the discomfort of others as your responsibility. You thought, if I'm quiet enough, calm enough, kind enough, maybe they'll let me stay. And so sorry became your shield. But a shield you carry long enough becomes a cage. Because after a while you stop needing someone else to disapprove, you disapprove of yourself automatically. You cut your brilliance down to size before anyone else has the chance. You lower your expectations so you don't get called entitled. You wrap your truth in soft disclaimers so it doesn't sound like confrontation. And somewhere in all that editing, you disappear. Not physically, but energetically. Your edges blur. Your voice dims. Your presence starts to feel optional. And that is not your truth. You were never meant to apologize for your existence. You were meant to inhabit it, fully, boldly, unapologetically. But to do that, you have to untangle from the lie that says your worth is conditional, because it's not. You don't earn the right to exist through usefulness. You don't qualify for love through politeness. You don't have to trade your truth for belonging. Real belonging doesn't require you to shrink. It invites you to expand. But you won't find it belonging if you're still pretending to be smaller than you are. You won't find it in rooms where you can only stay if you're silent. You won't find it in relationships where love is withheld the moment you show your full self. You won't find it in environments where your power is seen as a threat instead of a gift. So you have to be brave enough to stop apologizing, not because you're always right, but because you're allowed to be. Allowed to take up space, allowed to be heard, allowed to change your mind, allowed to say no, allowed to say this is who I am, without wrapping it in guilt. The world doesn't need more apologetic souls walking on eggshells. It needs people who are grounded in their presence, people who can say, I belong here, without explanation, people who can take a breath and not fill the silence with an apology. People who can honor their truth, even when it trembles. And that begins with catching yourself in the moment. When the word sorry forms on your tongue, ask, am I actually sorry? Or am I just afraid? Afraid of being misunderstood. Afraid of being too much. Afraid of taking up space I was always meant to occupy. And then choose differently. Choose to pause. Choose to own your voice. Choose to stay in your body instead of escaping through guilt. This isn't about arrogance, it's about accuracy. You don't need to apologize for taking a breath. You don't need to apologize for your boundaries, your brilliance, your humanity. You don't need to apologize for existing. Not today, not anymore. At first it feels like magic, like fate finally got it right, like someone has seen into your soul and said, yes, you. They're attentive, present, in tune. Every message is answered instantly. Every moment is filled with warmth. Compliments come like confetti. Eye contact lingers like a vow. And the pace Fast, intoxicating, irresistible. Makes it feel like destiny. But love bombing never looks like manipulation in the beginning. It looks like attention. It feels like affection. It tastes like the thing you've been starved for. Because it's not just flattery. It's intensity. It's immersion. It's a carefully curated fantasy designed to make your nervous system attach before your logic has time to question anything. And that's the trap. Because your body doesn't know it's being manipulated. Your body only knows, this feels good. This feels safe. This feels like love. And your biology is wired to move toward that. But real love doesn't rush your system. It doesn't overwhelm your boundaries with promises. It doesn't flood you with praise before it's earned your trust. It doesn't build a palace on a foundation it never asked if you were ready to pour. Love bombing does. Because love bombing isn't about you. It's about control. It's about bypassing your critical thinking with emotional overload. It's about getting you addicted to the feeling of being seen, so seen, that you'll ignore the red flags waving in the background. And the manipulators? They're good. They study what you crave. They reflect it back to you like a mirror. They pick up on your insecurities and immediately affirm the opposite. You don't feel worthy. They make you feel divine. You've never been chosen. They make you feel like the only person on earth. You're afraid of abandonment. They promise permanence so quickly it makes your head spin. But there's a difference between emotional intimacy and emotional hooking. Emotional intimacy grows. It deepens slowly. It respects pacing. It honors your boundaries. Emotional hooking hijacks your nervous system and anchors itself into your longing. It knows how to say all the right things, how to touch you just right, how to offer you the exact reassurance you've always wanted. And once you're hooked, once your brain starts associating them with feeling alive, you start rationalizing the warning signs. You overlook the way they get angry when you take too long to respond. You explain away the passive-aggressive comments. You dismiss the subtle pressure to always be available. Because the high is too good to question, your body gets addicted to the dopamine, the butterfly, the rush of being wanted so intensely. But here's the twist: the intensity was never about love. It was bait. Because what happens after the love-bombing phase ends is what reveals the game. They pull back. Suddenly the messages slow down. The compliments dry up. The emotional warmth becomes unpredictable, and your nervous system panics. What did I do wrong? Why does it feel like they're slipping away? How do I get back to what we had? And just like that, they have you. Because now you're chasing the high. You're trying to earn back the thing that was freely given at first. You're blaming yourself for the sudden shift, even though you didn't change. That's the point. Love bombing creates dependency. It attaches your sense of worth to their approval. It wires your brain to believe they are the source of your joy. It conditions you to accept inconsistency in the name of getting back to the beginning. But the beginning was never real. It was a performance, a setup, a carefully constructed emotional ambush designed to bypass your boundaries. And it works because it feels so good. Because when someone makes you feel like the center of their world, your brain releases oxytocin. Oxytocin creates bonding, and once bonded, you start defending the bond instead of defending yourself. You explain the behavior, you minimize the discomfort, you internalize the blame, because the emotional hooking was successful. And even worse, you start doubting your intuition. You think, I'm being too sensitive. Maybe I'm just afraid of love. They were so amazing in the beginning. I must be the problem now. But no, you're not the problem. The problem is that someone used your own biology against you, used your desire for connection as leverage, used your past wounds as an opening. That's not love. That's manipulation. Real love doesn't rush past your no. Real love doesn't bribe you with affection. Real love doesn't vanish once it gets what it wants. Real love waits for readiness. It builds trust, not dependency. It invites you to expand, not contract. And if the beginning feels too perfect, too fast, too intoxicating. Pause. Ask yourself, am I connecting to this person, or am I connecting to the version of me they're reflecting back to me? Do I feel free to say no, to slow down, to be imperfect? If I stop performing for their affection, will they still be here? Because love bombing doesn't want the real you. It wants the hooked you, the one who will self-sacrifice, who will self-blame, who will bend over backward to restore the illusion of a love that was never grounded in reality. Have you ever paused, in the middle of a thought, mid-sentence, mid-breath, and wondered, why did I just think that? Not what the thought was, but where it came from. It's easy to assume that your thoughts are your own, a stream bubbling from some private interior source. But what if I told you some of your thoughts weren't born in you at all? There is a whisper. You don't hear it the way you hear voices or sounds. It doesn't shout, it doesn't knock. It seeps, it drips into your perception like humidity, barely noticeable until everything is wet. It's not a sound, it's a suggestion, a small redirection, a subtle tightening of your chest when you see a certain face, a twitch of discomfort when a topic is mentioned, a tug in the direction of silence when something inside you wants to speak. That's how it starts. That's how the whisper works. And the most terrifying part? You never even notice it. It begins long before you knew there was anything to guard, before you knew that not all messages were neutral, before you knew that silence can be engineered and that instinct can be hacked. It starts when you're still soft, when the world is big and you are still small, looking up at everyone else for clues on how to be. In that place, in that softness, a seed is planted. Not by accident, but by design. Maybe it came in the form of a rule, don't talk back. Maybe it was a warning, you're being too sensitive. Or maybe it was a look, a glance of disapproval, just long enough to register, just short enough to pretend it wasn't real. That was the first whisper. You obeyed it without knowing, and it felt like safety. That's the thing about manipulation. It doesn't storm the gates of your mind. It knocks gently, wearing the face of someone you love. It tells you it's helping, that it's keeping you from embarrassment, from danger, from being alone. It learns your fears before you do, and then it speaks through them. A whisper becomes a rule becomes a belief, and a belief becomes your identity. You walk through your day and don't even realize how many of your actions are dictated by that quiet, internalized command. You see a stranger trip and your laughter catches in your throat, not because you're cruel, but because a whisper says, "Don't draw attention." You feel a surge of anger in a meeting, but you swallow it whole. The whisper reminds you, keep the peace. You think about taking a leap, quitting the job, saying the truth, starting fresh. But the whisper tightens its grip. That's too risky. Don't be foolish. Stay where it's safe. Safe, that's the word it uses. But what if it's not safety? What if it's surrender? You see, the mind doesn't always distinguish between external voices and internal thoughts. Once a message is repeated enough times, your brain takes it in like breath, effortlessly, unconsciously. The whisper becomes familiar. It becomes you. And that's the point, because the most effective manipulation doesn't look like force, it looks like choice. It lets you believe you are the one deciding, but if your decisions are based on fear you didn't place there, on judgments you never examined, on standards you inherited but never agreed to, is that really choice? Think of all the times you've hesitated without understanding why, all the things you haven't said, all the moments you played small even when something inside you begged to be big. Do you really think that came from you? Or are you simply echoing a whisper planted long ago? That whisper thrives in subtlety. It hides behind social norms, behind family traditions, behind the illusion of politeness and professionalism. It tells you not to rock the boat, not to speak out, not to stand alone. Because standing alone is dangerous, isn't it? But here's the truth they hope you never find. It was never about safety. It was always about silence. Because a silent person can be molded. A silent person won't resist. A silent person becomes a perfect container for someone else's will. And the scariest thing, you still think the silence is your choice. The whisper grows stronger with time. It adapts. It studies you. It learns your patterns. It knows when to be loud and when to be quiet. It doesn't just tell you what to do. It tells you how to feel. It shames you for hesitating. It applauds you for conforming. It rewards you with relief, not freedom. And slowly, you forget what your own voice sounds like. You forget what it felt like to move freely, to act without calculation, to speak without rehearsing how you'll be perceived. You become so conditioned that stillness feels like virtue and authenticity feels like rebellion. But there's something you need to know. You weren't born with that voice inside you. You were taught it. And anything learned can be unlearned. So tonight, as you drift towards sleep, I want you to notice, not fight, not argue, just notice. When a thought arises that tells you you're not enough, ask yourself, whose voice is that really? When a choice feels small and safe, ask, who benefits if I stay small? When discomfort whispers, just be quiet, ask, what would happen if I didn't? The whisper only has power in your unawareness. Once you notice it, you begin to loosen its grip. Because underneath all those layers, all those echoes of other people's expectations and fears, there is still a quieter, deeper voice. One that's been waiting. One that doesn't speak in fear, but in clarity. It's not loud, but it doesn't need to be, because it's yours. And when you listen closely, you realize it never left. It was just buried under everything you were told you had to be. Let this be the first moment of remembering. Let this be the first pause, not for sleep, but for awakening. The whisper that controlled you has finally been heard, and now you decide what happens next. You think you're in control, don't you? That every thought you have is yours, that every decision you make is the result of your own free will, that when you say, I want this or I believe that, you're speaking from a place of inner truth. But pause for a moment and ask yourself, how do you know? Where did that thought come from? What if it wasn't born inside you but placed? What if the belief that you're steering your own ship is the most brilliant illusion ever created? An illusion so convincing you've never once thought to question it. There's a hand on your back. You can't feel it, but it's there, guiding you, nudging you, sometimes gently, sometimes forcefully. And it's been there for so long that you've mistaken its influence for your own instinct. That's the invisible hand. It shows up in ways you'd never expect. A headline flashes across your screen. New study reveals hidden danger in your everyday habits. You feel a flicker of fear. You don't stop to examine it. You just shift. You scroll. You share. You adjust. But the thought didn't begin with you. It began with someone crafting that headline, knowing exactly what words would trigger you, what imagery would bypass your logic and go straight to your emotional core. This is not by accident. It's design. Marketers know it. Politicians rely on it. Tech companies are built on it. And the systems of power that feed off your attention? They've turned influence into an exact science. They've studied the architecture of your mind better than you have. They understand the way your brain processes threats. They know that fear overrides rationality. They know that repetition creates truth. They know that if they repeat something enough, in just the right tone, your brain will start to register it as reality, regardless of whether it's true. They don't need to force you to believe, they just need to make you feel it. And once you feel it, you'll convince yourself you see a product with a glowing review, 5 stars, words like life-changing and a must-have. You weren't even thinking of buying anything, but now, suddenly, you're curious. Your mind spins a narrative to justify the purchase. I do need this. It'll improve my life. It's a good deal. But the truth is, you didn't choose it. You were chosen for it. The review, paid. The image, filtered. The influencer recommending it, following a script. The entire experience, engineered. You were merely the endpoint of a psychological funnel. And it doesn't stop with shopping. It weaves into your relationships, into your reactions, into the way you see yourself in the mirror. You think you're not good enough? Who taught you that? You think you need to be quieter, smaller, easier to like? Who rewarded you when you shrank? You're not imagining it. You've been shaped, repeatedly, relentlessly. The invisible hand doesn't slap, it sculpts. From the toys you were given as a child to the roles you saw on screen. Someone, somewhere, was feeding you a version of what you were supposed to be. The obedient one, the high achiever, the beautiful one, the strong one, the perfect one. You were handed a script before you even knew how to read, and you memorized your lines to survive. You learned when to smile, when to keep your mouth shut, when to hold back your tears, when to laugh even if it hurt, when to nod even if you disagreed. And over time you forgot you were acting. It felt natural. It became natural. That's how deep influence goes. It doesn't just change your behavior, it alters your instincts. Imagine walking into a room and instinctively choosing the quiet corner. Why? You don't know. You just feel safer there. But maybe that instinct was planted years ago, when speaking up got you shamed, or when taking space meant being called arrogant. The memories faded, but the programming stuck. Or maybe you fall in love with someone who doesn't see you, who belittles you, who chips away at your confidence, and something inside you whispers, "This feels familiar." That familiarity, it's not fate, it's conditioning. It's the pattern you were taught to chase, because even your heart can be programmed. Every preference you think is yours may not be. Your favorite food, marketed. Your taste in music, influenced. Your standards for beauty, fed to you in high definition from the moment you could blink. You didn't create the rules, you just learned to play the game. But here's the kicker, the game is rigged. Because it doesn't care about your joy, it cares about your compliance. It doesn't care if you're free, it just wants you predictable, easier to sell to, easier to manage, easier to keep in line. So long as you believe your thoughts are your own, the system wins, because you won't rebel against yourself. That's the genius of dark psychology. It doesn't need chains, it uses ideas. It turns your own mind into a surveillance system. You judge yourself before anyone else can. You punish yourself for stepping out of line. You dismiss your own dreams because the whisper says, "Be realistic." You undermine your desires before the world even gets the chance. And every time you do that, the invisible hand tightens its grip. But here's what they never expected. They never expected you to stop. To ask, to question, to say, what if this feeling isn't mine? What if this belief doesn't belong to me? What if this instinct was installed? Because the moment you do, you put a crack in the illusion, and once you see the hand, you can move away from it. Not all at once, not in a rush, but gently, persistently. You start by noticing your reactions. You watch your thoughts like a curious outsider. You ask, "Why do I feel this way?" instead of simply obeying the feeling. And slowly you begin to separate what's yours from what was given. You begin to reclaim your mind. You won't be perfect at it. You'll fall into old patterns. You'll catch yourself too late. That's part of it. That's normal. Because you're not just unlearning habits. You're unraveling a lifetime of invisible influence. But with each layer you peel back, the fog lifts, and beneath it, you'll find something wild, unscripted, unpredictable. You'll find you, the real you. Not the version shaped by algorithms, not the one approved by systems, not the one muted by social scripts, but the one that whispers not from fear, but from truth. And when you finally hear that voice, you'll realize the hand that guided you is only invisible when your eyes are closed. And now, they're open. There isn't a weakness. It isn't a flaw in your design, it's a feature. It's one of the most ancient, most reliable, and most predictable systems in your entire being. And the terrifying truth is, those who understand that, have already learned how to use it against you. You're not being manipulated because you're broken, you're being manipulated because you work exactly as you're supposed to. Fear was never meant to be a prison. It was a guardian. It's what kept your ancestors alive. When they felt the rustle in the bushes or saw shadows flicker across the cave wall, fear made their hearts race, their breath quicken, their muscles coil tight and ready. It was never about logic. It was about survival. Fear didn't need to ask questions. It didn't need facts. It only needed signals. A sound they sent, a sudden shift in energy. That was enough. Run, hide, fight, freeze, react now, think later. And that same system is still alive in you. But here's the problem. The world you live in doesn't look like the one your ancestors faced. You're not running from saber-toothed predators or navigating through untouched wilderness. You're scrolling, reading, watching. You're surrounded not by physical danger, but by symbolic ones. Words, headlines, notifications, glances, posts. These are the new predators, and your nervous system reacts to them exactly the same way. A tweet can spike your cortisol. A comment can flood your bloodstream with adrenaline. A push notification can trigger your amygdala into full alert mode. It doesn't have to be real, it only has to feel real. And that's where the back door opens. The architects of fear, those who know its mechanics better than you do, don't need to threaten you directly, they only need to activate the system. A headline that says, "Are you in danger?" and don't know it. A breaking news segment playing dramatic music and red overlays. A political speech framed in apocalyptic terms, a marketing message that whispers, "You're not safe unless you buy this." They don't have to lie, they just have to hint, because fear does the rest. Your brain is hardwired to prioritize it, to freeze your logic center the moment a threat is perceived. The prefrontal cortex, the seat of reasoning, goes dim. The emotional brain, the limbic system, takes over. You're no longer reasoning, you're surviving. You click before you think, you believe before you question, you obey before you even realize you've made a decision. And they know this. They build systems around it. Why do you think the evening news always starts with danger? Why do headlines lean toward alarm, not nuance? Why do politicians talk more about enemies than ideas? Why do social media posts that spark outrage get more engagement than those that offer calm? Because fear captures attention, and attention is the new currency. But it doesn't stop there. Fear doesn't just hijack your awareness, it hijacks your memory. Studies show that emotionally charged fear-based information is stored more deeply and more vividly. That means you're more likely to remember the thing that scared you than the thing that educated you. And when your memory is shaped by fear, your future is too. You avoid situations that once made you anxious, even if they were harmless. You distrust people who remind you of someone who once hurt you, even if they've done nothing wrong. You prepare for worst-case scenarios, not because they're likely, but because your mind learned that fear deserves obedience. And that's the tragedy. Fear was designed to protect you, but when manipulated, it turns into your master. They don't need to control your thoughts, they only need to control what you're afraid of. And they start early. Think about the stories you were told as a child, not the fairy tales, but the warnings. Be careful. Don't talk to strangers. The world is dangerous. People can't be trusted. Each one planted a seed. Each one carved a groove in your mind that made it easier for fear to travel through later. Fear has momentum. Once it finds a path, it deepens the trail with every repetition. And in adulthood, that path becomes a highway. That's why you worry about what others think, even when you don't respect them. That's why you stay silent in rooms where you long to speak. That's why you play small when every part of you wants to expand. You don't want to fail. You don't want to be rejected. You don't want to be alone. But look closer. Peel it back. What you're really saying is, I'm afraid. Afraid of being wrong, afraid of being judged, afraid of losing control. And someone, somewhere, benefits from that fear. Because fear is an incredible motivator, not for growth, but for compliance. Fear makes you follow the rules. Fear makes you buy what you're told to buy. Fear makes you believe what makes no sense. Because fear isn't interested in sense. It's interested in relief. You reach for what soothes you, not what frees you. And that's the trap. They give you the fear, and then they sell you the cure. It's a brilliant loop. First, you're told the world is falling apart, that your body is breaking down, that your reputation is at risk, that danger is always just out of frame. And then you're offered the solution, a product, a policy, a belief system, a savior. It could be as simple as skin cream, or as complex as an ideology. But the formula is the same. Trigger the fear, then provide the fix. And you'll accept it gratefully, not because you're stupid, but because your brain is ancient. Your nervous system evolved for survival, not modern propaganda. You don't need to be gullible to be manipulated, you just need to be human. But here's the thing they never counted on. You can become aware, and when you do, the back door begins to close. You start to notice the moments your heart races unnecessarily. You catch the headlines trying to pull you into panic. You pause before you click, before you react, before you believe. You ask, is this real? Or is this engineered? And that question alone is enough to shift the dynamic. Because now you're not just reacting, you're observing, you're reclaiming, you're stepping out of the trap and onto solid ground. Fear isn't going to disappear. It's not supposed to. But it no longer has to own you. You can let fear be what it was always meant to be, a signal, not a sentence, a tool in your hands, not theirs. And that's where your freedom begins. You weren't born craving safety. You were born craving experience, exploration, connection. The unknown didn't scare you, it intrigued you. As a child, you reached for fire. You ran toward strangers. You touched things you were told not to. You laughed too loud. You fell without shame. And the world, in all its mystery, was yours to claim. Then something changed. Not all at once, but slowly, layer by layer. A word here, a warning there. A punished risk, a frightened adult. A punished mistake. You learned that safety wasn't just about avoiding harm. It was about avoiding disapproval, discomfort, difference. The rules were never written on a wall, but you memorized them anyway. Be careful, don't make waves, stay close, fit in. And just like that, you were ushered into the economy of fear, where safety is the currency and conformity is the cost. They never told you outright. They didn't have to. The system was designed to make you afraid of what might happen if you chose something other. They showed you examples of people who tried and failed. They highlighted the dangers, the outliers, the embarrassments. And when someone did succeed in doing things their own way, that story was tucked quietly out of view, dismissed as luck, privilege, anomaly. You were taught to play it safe, and now you do. You choose the familiar over the fulfilling. You stay in jobs that drain you. You remain in relationships that shrink you. You hold back your voice when your truth trembles in your chest. You say yes when everything inside you is begging for no. Why? Because you've been taught to equate safety with success, safety with goodness, safety with survival. It's not logic, it's programming. And it works. Because safety feels like relief. It's the sigh after a long day of pretending, the comfort of routine, the pleasure of being liked, the validation of doing what's expected. But what you don't see, what they hope you never see, is the price you're paying for that relief. Because every time you choose safety, you're buying it. And the cost is always the same, a piece of your power. You may not realize it, but there's a market out there built on your fear. A marketplace where safety is bought and sold like gold. And you're the buyer. Think about it. The security system you installed because of a commercial that played soft music over footage of a break-in. The insurance you purchased after hearing a horror story about what could go wrong. The supplement you swallowed because a headline said, "Are you at risk?" and don't even know it. The app you downloaded to track your every step, every meal, every breath, all in the name of control. This isn't about protection, it's about profit. They manufacture the danger, then sell you the defense. They create the tension, then market the solution. Your nervous system gets hijacked, your logic sits down, and your wallet opens. Because fear bypasses reason. And in a world designed to trigger that fear, over and over and over again, you're always paying to feel safe. But here's the part they really don't want you to know. Safety isn't a product. It isn't a service. It isn't even a promise anyone else can give you. It's a sensation, and sensations can be manipulated. They've studied how to evoke it, how to make you feel safe when you're still in danger, and how to make you feel endangered even when you're perfectly fine. They use colors, words, tones, headlines, and timing. Every piece of content you consume is a lever in this machine. Watch how easily your feelings shift. A video of violence, followed by an ad for home protection. A story of heartbreak, followed by an app promising love. A graph showing decline, followed by a financial guru selling certainty. It's not random. It's a psychological ballet, choreographed to make you move the way they want, toward their product, their belief, their narrative. And you call it choice, but how free is a choice made under duress? That's the genius of it. They don't have to take your power. You'll give it away willingly if they can convince you that safety lies on the other side of your surrender. Because when you're afraid, you don't want truth, you want comfort. You don't want complexity, you want answers. You'll believe the lie not because it's convincing, but because it feels like shelter in the storm. But here's the paradox. The more you buy safety, the less safe you become. Because real safety, the kind that's rooted in inner resilience, in truth, in trust, doesn't come from the outside. It doesn't come from locks or labels or likes. It doesn't come from hiding, shrinking, obeying. It comes from knowing you can face discomfort without breaking. It comes from trusting your voice even when it shakes. It comes from stepping into the unknown and realizing you can survive it. They've convinced you that safety is a destination, but it was never a place, it was a prison. And the moment you stop trading your power for protection, that prison begins to crack. You start saying no. You start speaking up. You start questioning the stories that once held you captive. And it's scary. Of course it is. You've been told your whole life that safety is the most important thing. But what if safety isn't the goal? What if it's the bait? Because the truth is, the life you want, the one that thrills you, stretches you, liberates you, it's on the other side of discomfort, the other side of uncertainty, the other side of risk. Not recklessness, not danger, but expansion. And expansion isn't safe, it never was. But it's real, it's alive, and for the first time in a long time, so are you. You don't have to keep paying for your own confinement. You don't have to keep mistaking stillness for peace. You don't have to keep settling for a life that feels numb but secure. You can choose a different currency, one made of courage, of clarity, of truth. And when you do, you'll realize you never needed to be safer, you needed to be freer, and now you are. Anxiety doesn't speak in full sentences. It speaks in flashes, in feelings, in fragments. A tightening in your chest, a shallow breath, a flicker of something going wrong before anything actually does. It's not the words themselves that grip you, it's what they awaken. But behind those words, someone is pulling the strings. You've been taught to believe that your anxiety is personal, that it comes from your own stress, your own life, your own overthinking. But what if much of that dread you carry was planted? What if it didn't begin in your body, but in the words you consume, the images you're shown, the headlines you scroll past without even realizing how deeply they imprint? They speak the language fluently. They know exactly how to say just enough to make your pulse quicken, but not enough to give you clarity. They dangle possibility, implication, suspicion. They don't confirm, they suggest. And your mind, desperate for certainty, fills in the blanks with worst-case scenarios. Could this be putting your family at risk? What you don't know might already be hurting you. Experts warn of silent killers lurking in everyday life. They never say what it is, not really. Because if they did, you could assess the threat, measure it, respond rationally. But they don't want a rational response. They want your fear, because fear pays better than calm ever will. When you're anxious, you click more, you watch longer, you scroll deeper, you buy faster. Your mind is wired to seek resolution, to soothe the discomfort, and they exploit that wiring every second of the day. Look at the headlines you see. They rarely just inform, they incite. Shocking new development. You won't believe what happened next. Why this trend could destroy your future. These aren't just words. They're psychological triggers. Your subconscious doesn't wait for context. It hears danger and flips the switch. And suddenly your body is responding to a threat that may not even exist. Your hands shake, your breathing shortens, your focus narrows, and now you're hooked. That's the cycle. Trigger, tension, search for relief, repeat. It's not just media, it's your entire digital environment. Think about the ads that appear after you've just spoken about something sensitive. The way your feed seems to reflect your deepest insecurities. The way every suggestion feels like it knows what you're afraid of, even before you do. It's not intuition, it's design. Algorithms track not only what you click, but how long you linger, what you hesitate over, what you hover on. That pause, that split second of discomfort, that's data. And it's used to refine what you'll see next. To keep you suspended in that state of just enough dread to keep consuming. Because anxiety keeps you coming back. Calm does not. And it doesn't stop with words. Images, too, are carefully chosen. They know that the human brain processes visuals faster and more emotionally than text. So they flood you with curated terror. A photo of a distressed child, a fire caught mid-flame, an anxious-looking person staring at a screen. These aren't accidents. They're emotional anchors. You don't even have to read the article. The image already did the damage. You feel unease without knowing why. And that's the scariest part. Anxiety doesn't need to make sense to be effective. It just needs to linger. It follows you into your day, into your choices. You find yourself over-preparing, triple-checking, replaying conversations, bracing for backlash that never comes. You worry about things that haven't happened and might never happen, but the worry feels real. It sits in your body like a memory. Because the language of anxiety doesn't speak to your mind, it speaks to your nervous system, and your nervous system doesn't care whether the threat is real. It only cares that you feel unsafe. So it keeps the alarm sounding, and they've learned to keep it ringing, softly enough to ignore, loudly enough to control. Even the platforms designed for connection use anxiety to drive behavior. Notifications are red for a reason. Red triggers urgency. A number beside an icon triggers FOMO. Silence triggers self-doubt. Why hasn't anyone responded? Why didn't they like my post? Did I say something wrong? You didn't invent these questions. You absorbed them, and they make you check again and again and again. This is the new fluency, a language of micro-panic designed to keep you from being still, because stillness is dangerous to them. Stillness creates awareness, and awareness breaks the spell. When you're still, you notice that you're not actually in danger, that your body is safe, that your heart is beating, that your breath is shallow not because you're in trouble, but because your mind has been taught to expect trouble. Stillness allows you to ask, what is this really about? And suddenly the illusion cracks. You realize that most of what you're afraid of is vague, undefined, learned. You've been taught to fear discomfort, failure, embarrassment, rejection. But those aren't threats, they're human experiences. And yet you treat them like predators because the language around them told you they were. Think about the way we talk about uncertainty. It's always paired with danger. risky, volatile, unstable. But what if uncertainty is just space? Space to change, to move, to evolve. They don't want that. Because an anxious mind is easier to control. It wants direction, it wants answers, it clings to what feels solid, even if that solid thing is a lie. So they offer you anchors, false certainty, simplified narratives, quick fixes. And you take them, not because you believe them, but because they soothe the ache. Anxiety is exhausting. You'll believe anything if it promises relief. But relief isn't found in submission. Relief is found in truth. And truth starts with noticing the language you've been fed. So pay attention. Notice the words that spike your pulse, the phrases that stir dread, the patterns that keep you hooked, not so you can fight them, but so you can see them. Because once you see them, they start to lose their grip. You start to reclaim your inner dialogue. You speak to yourself with clarity, not panic. You recognize when anxiety is yours and when it's not. And you remember, anxiety may speak loudly, but you don't have to answer. You can hear it and not obey it. You can feel it and still choose calm. You can observe the dread and walk right through it. Because when you stop speaking their language, you start remembering your own. And your language doesn't begin in fear. It begins in freedom. It sounds reasonable, doesn't it? Be practical, be realistic, think it through. Don't make a scene, wait your turn, follow the steps, keep your voice down, play by the rules. That's how they get you. Because none of those statements seem threatening. None of them sound like control. In fact, they sound like wisdom, like advice from someone who cares, like the mature, rational path. But what if I told you that beneath those polished words is something far more sinister, something quiet, something precise, something designed to make you obey without ever realizing you've surrendered? They don't need you to believe in the system, they just need you to follow it. And the easiest way to make you follow it is to convince you that obedience is logic, that submission is sensibility, that conformity is intelligence. So you think you're making a smart choice when you stay silent in a meeting that makes your skin crawl. You think you're being mature when you take the secure job instead of chasing what you love. You think you're being wise when you ignore your gut because someone told you it wasn't rational. But what if your gut was right all along? What if the very thing you're being praised for, your reason, your patience, your compliance, is actually the mechanism of your control? This is how it works. From a young age, you're rewarded for sitting still, for raising your hand, for saying the right answer, for following directions without question, not just in school, everywhere, at home, at work, online. Your worth becomes tied to how well you fit, not how deeply you feel. Your value becomes dependent on how easily you can be managed. And when that's all you've ever known, rebellion feels foolish, dangerous, childish. You hear a voice inside you whispering something's wrong, but you override it with what you've been taught is wisdom. Just do what you're told. Don't overreact. This isn't the time. But who decides when the time is right? Who told you that logic and obedience were the same thing? That's the trick. They cloak obedience in the costume of rationality. They make resistance look reckless. They teach you that the most valuable trait you can possess is restraint. Not curiosity, not creativity, not courage, but restraint. And restraint is easy to control. Because restrained people don't ask hard questions. They don't start uncomfortable conversations. They don't disrupt systems that exploit them. They become self-regulating. They become the perfect citizen, the perfect employee, the perfect follower. Not because they've been forced, but because they believe it's smart. You weren't forced into obedience. You were educated into it. You learned to second-guess yourself. You learned to mistrust emotion. You learned to view certainty in your instincts as arrogance. You learned to bow to the altar of reason, even when it meant abandoning what you knew deep in your bones. But what if that version of reason was never yours? What if it was a framework handed to you by those who benefit most from your silence? Look around. Who gets called logical? Who gets to define what makes sense? Who gets to decide what is too risky, too loud, too much? It's not the dreamers, not the questioners, not the rebels. It's those who already hold the power. And their version of logic is calibrated to preserve that power. So of course, they'll tell you that speaking up is reckless. Of course, they'll frame your refusal as naive. Of course, they'll say that the system is broken, but now isn't the time to fix it. And you, being the intelligent, thoughtful person you are, might believe them. Because they're not shouting, they're not threatening, they're using your own sense of reason against you. That's how deep it goes. Obedience doesn't have to look like submission. It can look like rationality, it can look like professionalism, it can look like maturity. And if you're not careful, you'll live your whole life mistaking those masks for truth. You'll dismiss the people who act on instinct as foolish. You'll criticize those who feel too deeply as irrational. You'll distance yourself from anything that looks like chaos, even if that chaos is freedom trying to get in. Because freedom isn't tidy. It doesn't always look like logic. Sometimes it looks like walking away from everything that makes sense. Sometimes it looks like asking a question that makes the room go silent. Sometimes it looks like trusting your gut, even when every voice around you says you're wrong. And that's terrifying, because you've been taught that deviation is danger. But what if it's not? What if deviation is just the shape of your truth? What if logic has limits? Because here's the truth they never wanted you to find. Reason is a tool, but it's not the whole map. Your intuition, your emotions, your body, they hold wisdom too. And when you ignore them in favor of the script, you betray yourself. You become a walking blueprint of someone else's idea of right. No one questions it, not even you, until one day the cost becomes too high. The job that looked smart on paper but leaves you hollow. The relationship that seems stable but stifles your voice. The life that checks all the boxes but none of the desires you tucked away in the corners of your heart. And that's when the illusion begins to break. You realize that what you called logic was often fear in disguise. A fear of being wrong, of being judged, of being alone. There's a difference between caution and wisdom. Wisdom says, listen deeply. Fear says, stay quiet. Wisdom says, ask. Fear says, don't rock the boat. Wisdom says, trust your knowing. Fear says, prove it first. And you don't need to prove what your soul already knows. You don't need to justify your rebellion if your heart is starving for something more. You just need to remember. Logic isn't always liberation. Sometimes it's the leash. And the moment you see that, the moment you stop mistaking obedience for intelligence, the moment you realize that your compliance isn't clarity, it's conditioning, that's the moment you become dangerous. Not because you're reckless, but because you're finally thinking for yourself. And that is the first real act of freedom. You've always believed you are you, that your personality, the way you think, the way you react, the way you carry yourself, is something that emerged naturally, something that belongs uniquely to you. You call yourself an introvert or an extrovert, a thinker or a feeler, a leader or a follower. You describe yourself with words you've collected over time: shy, bold, anxious, responsible, creative, sensitive. But pause for a moment and ask yourself this. Where did those labels come from? Who decided what parts of you were acceptable and which were too much? Because the truth is, your personality, this structure you live inside of, wasn't handcrafted by your deepest self. It was shaped, molded, assigned, not maliciously, often not even consciously, but through repetition, reward, correction and control. The narrator in your mind, the one who defines who you are and what you're capable of, was formed long before you had the ability to question it. It starts early. So early, in fact, you don't remember the beginning. Maybe you were called difficult because you asked too many questions. Maybe you were praised for being easygoing when you didn't express your needs. Maybe you were the smart one, the funny one, the quiet one, the helper. You heard the words again and again. You saw how people responded to you. Their smiles when you behaved, their tension when you didn't, their disappointment when you acted outside the role. And you learned, without even knowing you were learning. You adjusted, you smoothed out the edges they didn't like, you exaggerated the parts that got approval, you buried the instincts that made people uncomfortable. You memorized a role not because it was true, but because it was safe. And safety at that age feels like love. So you played the part, and you became the part. What else could you do? You weren't wrong for adapting, you were surviving, navigating a world built by people who themselves had been shaped the same way, and because they didn't know how to hold their own pain, they projected it onto you. Don't be too loud. Don't cry like that. Why can't you be more like your sister? You always mess things up. Those weren't just words, they were bricks. Bricks in the wall that became your personality. You started to tell yourself stories. I'm not good at that. I'm always the one who has to keep the peace. I don't like attention. I'm just a worrier. I'm too emotional. I'm too much. The narrator took notes. It watched. It remembered. It repeated. Until the voice inside your own head didn't sound like you anymore. It sounded like them. That's what no one tells you. Most of your self-talk isn't your voice. It's an echo, a chorus of judgments, labels, expectations, all dressed up as identity. You think, this is just who I am, but it's not. It's who you became to survive. And the difference is everything. Because if your personality was created by conditioning, then it can be reshaped, it can be expanded, it can be released. But only if you're willing to face the terrifying truth. You don't really know who you are yet. That's not failure. That's opportunity. Because beneath the layers of adaptation and performance is something raw, unscripted, undomesticated, something real, not perfect, not polished, but honest. And it's been waiting for you to notice that the life you're living might not fit because it was never built for the real you. It was built for the version of you that made other people comfortable, the version that didn't take up too much space, the version that asked for less, that smiled on cue, that managed everyone else's emotions at the expense of your own. But what if you stopped managing? What if you let the narrator rest? What if you spoke in your own voice? Messy, unfiltered, true. The moment you do, the programming starts to crack. You notice that the traits you once wore like skin don't feel natural anymore. Maybe you're not an introvert, you were just told to be quiet. Maybe you're not always anxious, you just never had a safe place to relax. Maybe you're not uncreative, you just learned to fear being wrong. How much of you is actually you, or better yet, how much of you is a performance? These aren't easy questions. They won't be answered overnight. But asking them is the beginning, because the moment you start to question the narrator, the moment you begin to doubt the voice that narrates your life, you begin to break free. You begin to notice the subtle moments where you shrink without knowing why, the way you hesitate to speak up in groups, the way you immediately apologize when you haven't done anything wrong, the way you avoid trying new things because someone once laughed when you failed, and you realize you've been living inside a story someone else wrote. But you don't have to keep reading from that script. You get to rewrite it, not by becoming someone else, but by unbecoming everything that isn't really you. That takes courage, because the old personality, the one built from fear and praise and punishment, it will fight to stay. It will whisper that you're not capable, that you're being selfish, that you'll end up alone, that people will leave if you change, but those aren't prophecies. They're patterns, and patterns can be broken. Every time you act differently than the narrator expects, you confuse it, you challenge it, you interrupt the loop. And in that interruption, something new can emerge. You speak up, even though your voice shakes. You set a boundary, even though the guilt swells in your chest. You try something new, even though part of you still hears that old voice saying, you'll mess it up. And then something shifts. Not all at once, but enough to feel it, enough to recognize that maybe, just maybe, there's more to you than you've been allowed to know. You are not the narrator, you are the one listening. And now, you're the one choosing. Because your personality doesn't have to be a cage, it can be a canvas. You can paint something new, something honest, something that sounds more like the voice you lost before you even knew it was yours. And that voice? It's still here, waiting for you to remember. There's a voice inside your head. You know the one. It narrates everything. It comments when you look in the mirror. It speaks when you're lying in bed at night staring at the ceiling, unable to sleep. It echoes after conversations, second-guessing what you said. It warns you when you're about to take a risk. It sighs in disappointment when you fail. It tells you who you are, what you're worth, and where your limits are. And you believe it. Because it sounds like you, it uses your words, it borrows your tone, it feels like it's coming from inside. So you never question it, never examine it, never ask where it came from. But tonight I want you to ask something bold. What if that voice isn't really yours? What if the whisper you've trusted for so long isn't the voice of truth, but the echo of influence? You weren't born with that inner narrator. You didn't come into the world with a running script of judgment, fear, doubt, and self-critique. That voice developed over time. It was assembled, piece by piece, moment by moment. From every comment, every raised eyebrow, every expectation, every comparison. From teachers who told you to stay in line. From parents who didn't know how to hold your emotions. From peers who punished your authenticity. From a culture that profits off your self-doubt. You absorbed it all. And the voice formed. It started with little things. You always get this wrong. Don't be dramatic. No one likes someone who complains. Why can't you be more like? Words that were spoken once, maybe twice, but replayed endlessly in your head, until they stopped sounding like them and started sounding like you. And that's the myth, that the voice inside your head is you, that it's your intuition, your guidance, your wisdom. But real intuition doesn't speak in shame. It doesn't rush. It doesn't spiral. It doesn't paralyze you with fear. That's programming. That's internalized control. Because once they've taught you to self-monitor, they no longer have to. Once they've installed the critic, the judge, the skeptic inside you, you'll manage yourself better than they ever could. You'll hold yourself back. You'll talk yourself out of things. You'll carry guilt that was never yours. You'll silence your own truth. And the whole time you'll think it's just your inner voice. But you were never meant to be ruled by an echo. You were meant to speak from your center. So how do you tell the difference? The false voice, the installed voice, rushes you, pressures you. It speaks in absolutes. You always mess this up. You're never going to change. No one will care what you have to say. It loops endlessly, repeating the same fears, the same judgments, the same familiar pain. It's loud when you're still. It shames you for wanting more. It masks itself as realistic, but it never leaves room for growth. The true voice, the one buried underneath, feels quieter but stronger. It doesn't shout. It doesn't panic. It feels calm, even when it's guiding you towards something unknown. It doesn't insult you. It doesn't label you. It reminds you of what you've always known but have forgotten. It speaks not to your wounds but to your wholeness. It doesn't beg to be heard. It waits. And most people never hear it because the false voice drowns it out. Think about how many times you've stopped yourself from speaking up, not because you didn't have something valuable to say, but because the voice told you, they'll think you're stupid. How many times you didn't apply, didn't reach out, didn't try, because the voice whispered, you're not ready, you're not good enough, why even bother? Those aren't facts, those are chains, invisible ones, and they tighten every time you mistake them for truth. But you can start to notice, you can start to listen differently. Ask yourself, would I speak to someone I love this way? If the answer is no, then it's not your real voice. It's not wisdom, it's not guidance, it's conditioning wearing your mask. And when you begin to unmask it, something incredible happens. You realize you have a choice. You realize you don't have to believe every thought you think, that not all mental activity is truth, that your brain is a storyteller, and some of those stories were ghost-written by people who never had your best interest in mind. The critic, you inherited it. The doubt, you rehearsed it. The fear, you were trained into it. But the real you, the one who lives beneath all the noise, is still intact. And when you create enough stillness, enough space, you start to hear it. A different tone, a different rhythm, a voice that doesn't rush to conclusions, that doesn't catastrophize, that doesn't manipulate you into playing small. It asks different questions. What if you're more powerful than you realize? What if the life you want isn't ridiculous, it's remembered? What if the discomfort you feel isn't a sign you're failing, but a signal you're growing? That's the true voice, and you don't need to find it, it's already there. You just need to stop mistaking the noise for the signal. You don't need to shout over the false voice, you only need to stop believing it. And that takes practice. It takes noticing when the voice appears. It takes pausing before you accept its script. It takes asking, where did I first hear this? Who benefits when I believe it? What would I do if I didn't trust this voice anymore? That's where the transformation begins, not by erasing the voice, but by reclaiming your authority over it, by choosing which voice gets to guide you now. Because the most dangerous thing about the inner voice isn't that it exists, it's that it can be hijacked. And the most liberating thing? You can take it back. You can rewrite the dialogue. You can speak in a new language, one rooted in compassion, courage, and clarity, and when you do, something sacred happens. You stop living in reaction to fear, you start living in alignment with your truth, not the version of truth you were taught to believe, the one you remembered once the noise was quiet enough to hear again. And that voice, that one is truly yours. Your memories are sacred, aren't they? They feel like anchors, like proof. They tell you who you are, where you've been, what you've survived. They help you make sense of yourself. They remind you of what to avoid and what to reach for. And maybe you've always assumed your memories are yours. Private, untouchable, solid. But they're not. Memory is not a photograph. It's not a recording. It's a story. A living, shifting, malleable thing. And like any story, it can be rewritten, edited, reframed. Not only by you, but by others. And the terrifying truth is this. They've already started rewriting it for you. Not with your permission, with your attention. They don't need to change your entire history. They only need to change the emotional meaning of a few key events. They don't have to erase your past. They just have to reinterpret it until the version you carry serves them more than it serves you. Because if they can shape your memories, they can shape your identity, and if they can shape your identity, they don't have to control your future. You'll do that for them. That's the real power of memory. It's not just about what happened, it's about what you believe happened. And that belief controls everything. But let's go deeper. Do you remember your childhood clearly? Or is it a collection of fragments, flashes, sensations, stories told about you, not by you? You were always so shy. You were the dramatic one. You were such a troublemaker. You heard these stories enough times and you accepted them, not because you remembered them, but because everyone around you agreed. And agreement feels like truth. But repetition is not reality. It's programming. Maybe you were labeled the sensitive one, not because you were, but because you refused to go numb. Maybe you were called difficult, not because you were disobedient, but because you questioned the rules. Maybe you weren't lazy. You were overwhelmed, unsupported, unseen. But no one told you that. But you're not here for illusion. You're here for something real. Something that doesn't start with fireworks and end in confusion. Something that doesn't rely on highs and crashes. Something that doesn't make you question your own sanity. You're here for a love that holds, not one that hunts. And the first step in finding that love is breaking the hook. By slowing down, by listening to your body, by trusting that if it feels too good too soon, it might not be love at all, it might be a strategy. A trick of dark psychology disguised as romance. A nervous system ambush dressed up as soul connection. But now you see it. And when you see it, you reclaim your power. Not just from them, but from the part of you that thought you had to be swept away to be worthy. You don't need to be overwhelmed to be loved. You don't need to be addicted to feel alive. You don't need the fantasy to finally feel real. You just need you. Rooted, steady, clear, and love, the kind that honors you, will recognize that presence, not rush it, not replicate it, but meet it. And nothing about that will feel like a hook, it will feel like home. It doesn't start with shouting, it starts with doubt. Small, almost invisible. A raised eyebrow when you speak your truth. A slow, deliberate, "Are you sure?" when you recall what happened. A gentle laugh, like you've exaggerated something again. A pause, long enough to make you question if your memory is really as solid as it felt. This is gaslighting in its most dangerous form. The quiet kind. Not the explosive denial or blatant lies, but the subtle erosion of your inner knowing. Not the fist slamming down on truth, but the whisper that seeps under your skin until you don't trust yourself anymore. Because that's the goal. Gaslighting isn't just about manipulation, it's about confusion. Confusion that leads to control. If they can make you doubt your own reality, they never have to take accountability for theirs. And they don't have to silence you directly. You'll do it for them. You'll start second-guessing your instincts. You'll rewrite your stories in real time, softening the edges that once felt sharp. You'll replay conversations over and over, trying to find the part where you misheard, misunderstood, overreacted. But you didn't. You were clear, you were certain, you were right to feel what you felt. And still, they made you question it. That's the power of gaslighting. It doesn't take away your voice, it convinces you to hand it over. It convinces you to shrink your reality until it fits their version. And once you've accepted that, once you've traded your truth for their comfort, they can mold you into whatever they need. It's not just emotional abuse, it's psychological warfare. Because gaslighting doesn't just attack your memories, it attacks your sense of self. You start wondering, am I too sensitive? Am I overreacting? Am I just broken somehow? You twist yourself into emotional pretzels trying to justify their behavior because the alternative would mean acknowledging that someone you trusted is actively undermining your reality. And that realization hurts. So you take the blame instead. You convince yourself it's your fault for not communicating better, for expecting too much, for remembering things incorrectly. But what if you didn't remember it wrong? What if you were never overreacting? What if you were gaslit so expertly that you forgot how to trust your own eyes, ears, and intuition? That's how deep it goes. You lose access to yourself. And the longer it continues, the harder it becomes to separate your thoughts from their influence. You start editing your emotions before you even feel them. You start suppressing your instincts before they fully form. You start questioning whether you even have the right to be hurt. And that's when they win. Because now you're no longer reacting to them. You're reacting to the ghost of their voice inside your mind. They don't have to be present to manipulate you anymore. They've installed themselves inside your perception. That's the final stage of gaslighting. Self-erasure. You stop trusting your own emotional compass. You stop honoring your own inner narrative. You stop defending your experience because you're not even sure what's real anymore. And the scariest part? From the outside, everything looks fine. To friends, to family, to co-workers, it looks like a normal relationship, maybe even a good one. Because gaslighting doesn't leave visible wounds. It leaves questions, silence, hesitation. A look in your eyes that says, I don't know if I'm allowed to feel this. And if you try to explain it, you sound unsure, because you are unsure. That's the damage. But let me remind you of something they never wanted you to remember. You are not crazy. You are not broken. You are not unstable. The truth, You are gaslit. And now you're waking up, because the moment you name it, the moment you recognize that the confusion was never yours to carry, you begin to reclaim your reality. You begin to anchor back into your truth, to feel your anger as valid, to see your memories as real, to hear your intuition again, not as noise, but as guidance. That's where your power begins to return, in the choice to stop explaining yourself to people committed to misunderstanding you, in the courage to say, "I know what I experienced," even if you refuse to admit it, in the quiet defiance of trusting your gut, especially when someone tells you not to. You don't need proof to believe yourself. You don't need a witness to make your story real. You were there. You felt it. You know. And that knowing, that deeply felt, soul-deep certainty, is what gaslighting tried to take from you. But it didn't succeed, because here you are, searching, asking, rebuilding, which means some part of you never fully forgot. That part is your compass, and now you get to strengthen it. Not just so you can leave the manipulation, but so you can recognize it before it ever reaches you again. You'll notice the red flags faster, you'll hear the twist in their tone, you'll feel the moment when your body says, "This isn't safe." And this time, you'll listen, because your reality is sacred, and no one, no matter how charming, how convincing, how close, gets to rewrite it without your permission. Not anymore. Kindness has always been sacred to you. You were raised to believe it was the highest virtue, that if someone was kind, they were good, that warm eyes and soft tones meant safety, that compliments meant connection, that patience meant purity, and because you value kindness, because it's the language your heart speaks, you instinctively trust those who offer it. But what happens when kindness isn't kindness at all? What happens when it's a costume? Because not everyone who smiles at you has your best interests at heart. Not every gentle word comes from a gentle place. Not every warm gesture is rooted in love. Sometimes it's strategy. Sometimes the most dangerous people in the room don't raise their voice. They don't threaten. They don't control with force. They control with favor, with charm, with generosity, with presence. They make you feel seen, not just in the surface way, but in the soulful way. They mirror your emotions, they echo your values, they study your needs and offer themselves as the answer. But it's not love, it's leverage. Because once you trust them, once you lower your guard and invite them in, they begin to shape the environment around you, gently, subtly, with grace. So subtle, in fact, that you don't even realize it's happening. They don't demand obedience, they inspire loyalty. They don't restrict you, they guide you. They don't make rules, they suggest what's best for you. And the whole time, they wear the mask of kindness, the mask that convinces you this can't be manipulation, because they're so thoughtful, so helpful, so present. How could someone who treats you this well possibly be harming you? But real harm doesn't always come wrapped in cruelty. It often arrives in the arms of someone who only wants what's best for you. They help you when you're vulnerable. They're the first to offer support. They create a bond so deep, so fast, that your nervous system relaxes around them. And that's when the shaping begins. You don't even notice the shift at first. You start making small adjustments to keep the peace. You choose certain words because you know how they'll respond. You give them the benefit of the doubt again and again because you remember how kind they were at the start, how much they gave, how they were there for you when others weren't. And now that kindness becomes a hook. You feel like you owe them. You feel guilty for questioning them. You feel conflicted for needing space. You feel like setting a boundary would be betrayal, because they were so good to you. But that's the trap. True kindness doesn't create debt. It doesn't keep score. It doesn't use past generosity as a tool for present control. When kindness is real, it's free. It empowers. It liberates. It gives without strings. But when kindness is camouflage, it comes with a contract. A contract you never signed but keep paying anyway, in silence, in compliance, in shrinking your truth to protect their image. And if you try to speak up, if you start to question the dynamic, they'll be ready. They'll remind you how good they've been to you. They'll paint your discomfort as ingratitude. They'll double down on the narrative that they are the victim now. And suddenly, you're the one who looks unkind, unreasonable, ungrateful. That's how well the mask works. Because predators who use kindness as a shield don't just manipulate how you see them, they manipulate how others see them too. They curate their image so carefully, so convincingly, that if you ever tried to expose the harm, you'd sound like the liar. Are you sure? They're such a good person. They've always been so sweet. I can't imagine them doing something like that. And you start to question yourself again, because when everyone else sees the mask, it's hard to trust your experience. That's the genius of the strategy. It doesn't just hide the harm, it reverses it. It paints you as the aggressor. It makes your boundaries look like cruelty. It reframes your exit as betrayal, and you end up apologizing for protecting yourself. But here's the truth. Kindness that costs you your self-trust is not kindness. Kindness that guilt trips you into staying silent is not kindness. Kindness that punishes your boundaries was never kindness to begin with. It was manipulation in disguise. And the deeper your empathy runs, the easier it is for them to use it against you. Because people who weaponize kindness know exactly what they're doing. They know you won't want to hurt someone who's done so much for you. They know you'll agonize over every decision that makes them uncomfortable. They know your loyalty runs deep, and they count on that. They count on you being too kind to call them out. Too loyal to walk away, too doubtful to trust what your body is screaming at you. But your body knows. It knows when something doesn't feel right. It knows when your nervous system is flooded with confusion instead of peace. It knows when you're not free, even if everything looks perfect on the surface. And you don't need anyone else to validate that knowing. You don't need proof. You don't need permission. You don't need a breakdown to justify your breakthrough, you just need to listen. Because the moment you stop prioritizing appearances and start honoring what's real, the mask falls away. You see it for what it is. Not kindness, not love, not safety, just a tactic, a performance, a control mechanism. And when you see that clearly, everything changes. You stop feeling guilty for protecting your energy. You stop second-guessing your discomfort. You stop romanticizing relationships that ask you to abandon yourself, because no amount of kindness is worth your self-erasure. You don't have to be cruel to reclaim your space. You just have to stop mistaking warmth for safety. You just have to trust that your clarity is more sacred than their image. And you just have to remember, you are not here to be impressed by the mask. You are here to protect your truth. You've seen the smile before, the one that feels warm on the surface but somehow chills your gut, the one that offers help before you even ask for it, so generous, so thoughtful, so perfectly timed, the one that makes you feel like you're lucky to be cared for by someone so selfless. And maybe for a moment you believe it, maybe you accept the favor, you let them pick up the bill, run the errand, solve the problem, offer their shoulder, you feel grateful, maybe even relieved. You tell yourself what a kind person, what a gift this is. But what you don't see, what they never say, is that every favor came with a hidden invoice, an invisible debt already calculated in full, and eventually it comes due. Not with words at first, but with subtle shifts. A change in tone, a delayed reply, an edge in their voice that wasn't there before. You wonder what you did wrong. You replay the last few conversations. You start walking on eggshells. You feel the energy shift without knowing why. And then it hits you. They're disappointed. Not because you crossed a boundary, but because you didn't pay the unspoken price. Maybe you didn't agree with them loudly enough. Maybe you weren't available when they needed you. Maybe you dared to say no after they said yes so many times before. Whatever it was, the favor has now become a weapon, because their kindness was never unconditional. It was currency. And every smile had strings. You didn't see the strings at first because they were wrapped in sugar, they were woven with compliments, they were disguised as devotion. But now you feel them pulling, tightening, controlling, and you start to question yourself. You think, maybe I'm being ungrateful. Maybe I do owe them something. Maybe I should just go along with what they want. It's the least I can do. But that's how the cycle begins. It's not love. It's not generosity. It's a transaction. You didn't ask for the gift, but now you're expected to repay it. And the repayment isn't always material, it's energetic. Your time, your loyalty, your silence. They helped you move last year, so now you can't say no when they cross a boundary. They've been such a good friend, so now you feel obligated to support them, even when they're hurting you. They've done so much for you, so now any disagreement feels like betrayal. That's the trap. When kindness becomes currency, every connection becomes a contract. And contracts can be enforced, even the ones you never signed. You feel the pressure not just to reciprocate, but to comply, to keep the peace, to make sure you're not seen as selfish or ungrateful, because that's the threat they dangle, whether they say it outright or not. Don't forget what I've done for you. And beneath that, the real message: you owe me. But here's the truth they never want you to realize. You don't owe anyone for kindness that came with strings. You don't owe your obedience just because someone offered help. You don't owe your voice, your time, your values in exchange for emotional leverage. Because that's not kindness, that's control. It's giving with one hand while the other quietly builds a cage. And the longer you stay in the cycle, the more tightly that cage closes. You start making decisions based on their approval. You start anticipating their reactions before you even act. You start shaping your identity around the unspoken terms of the relationship. Until one day you look in the mirror and don't recognize who you've become, because somewhere along the way the smile with strings rewrote your definition of love. It told you love is earned, that care must be repaid, that devotion comes with a price. But none of that is true. Love is not a transaction. Generosity is not a debt. And real kindness doesn't require a receipt. You're allowed to receive help without guilt. You're allowed to say thank you without obligation. You're allowed to be supported without being owned. Because the people who love you for you won't keep score. They won't turn favors into threats. They won't use the past to manipulate your present. They will give freely, and when they need something in return, they will ask, directly, honestly, without guilt or games. That's the difference between connection and control. Control relies on strings. Connection relies on choice. So if you feel pressure where there should be peace, if you feel tension where there should be trust, if you feel guilt instead of gratitude, then it's time to look closely, because the smile might be real, the warmth might be real, but if it comes with strings, it's not love, it's leverage. And you are not here to be leveraged. You are not here to play the role of grateful servant to someone who demands payment in emotional currency. You are not here to be bound by invisible contracts. You are here to be free. And freedom means recognizing that not all generosity is genuine, that not all help is selfless, that not all warmth is safe. And the moment you stop paying debts you never agreed to is the moment you start living in truth. You'll lose some people. The ones who depended on your guilt, your silence, your need to be nice. Let them go, because what stays, what remains after the strings are severed, will be real. It won't come with invoices. It won't require compliance. It won't punish you for being sovereign. It will offer and allow you to say yes or no without fear, because that is kindness. They don't need to raise their voice. They don't need to issue threats with clenched fists or overt commands. All they need is to let you feel their pain, to drop a sigh at the right moment, to go quiet when you speak your truth, to say it's fine with that heavy silence that says it's anything but. This is emotional blackmail, and it happens most often in the places that are supposed to feel the safest. Your home, your family, your friendships, your most intimate relationships, because the closer they are, the more access they have, and the more access they have, the easier it is to pull the strings of your empathy. And you, being someone who feels deeply, who cares, who listens, won't always see it as manipulation. Not at first. You'll see it as emotional complexity, as someone who's struggling, as someone who maybe just needs more time, more reassurance, more of you. So you give, you quiet your needs, you soften your tone, you tread gently. You think, they're just going through something, I don't want to make it worse. But what if it's always like this? What if every time you assert yourself it hurts them, becomes another source of their suffering? What if your growth, your truth, your clarity somehow becomes your fault? That's not love. That's emotional blackmail. It's when someone uses your own compassion as leverage, when they weaponize your empathy to make you responsible for their emotions, when the mere threat of their pain is enough to make you stay silent. And they don't have to say it out loud. They just have to imply, as if you really cared you wouldn't do this. If you loved me, you'd know how much this hurts. I guess I'm just always the problem. And suddenly your nervous system kicks in, not out of fear of violence, but out of fear of being the bad one. That's the hook. You're not afraid of them hurting you, you're afraid of you hurting them. So you pull back, you make yourself smaller, you choose harmony over honesty again and again. And they let you, because they know exactly what they're doing. They know that all they have to do is collapse, withdraw, or act wounded, and you'll abandon yourself to save them. That's the pattern. You become their emotional caretaker, their regulator, their safety net. Not because they ask directly, but because they never have to. They just have to react in ways that make you question whether your truth is too sharp, your feelings too inconvenient, your desires too demanding. And the result? You edit yourself. Not because you want to, but because the cost of being real feels too high. Because every time you show up fully, you're met with silence, sadness, or subtle shame. And shame is a powerful leash. It whispers, look what you've done. Look how much you've hurt them. You should feel bad. And you do. So you apologize. You retract. You make amends for things that were never wrong, and they let you. Because that's how emotional blackmail works. It doesn't force you to stay. It guilts you into staying. It creates an emotional prison where your freedom is the enemy of their stability. And you start to believe the lie. That keeping them okay means keeping yourself less expressive, less opinionated, less clear, less you. Until one day you realize you're living in a relationship where your authenticity is the threat. Not your rage, not your betrayal, just your truth. And no matter how gently you try to speak it, it always hits them like a weapon. Because that's the game. You're not allowed to be fully human. You're allowed to be convenient, supportive, safe, predictable, but not real. Because realness threatens the story they've built about who you're supposed to be. And when you break character, they punish you. Not with cruelty, but with collapse. That's the genius of emotional blackmail. It turns you into the villain in your own story. It makes you question whether self-respect is selfish. It makes you feel like your needs are too much. But they're not. What's too much is carrying the emotional weight of someone who refuses to carry their own. And it doesn't matter if they're your partner, your parent, your sibling, your oldest friend. Love without boundaries isn't love. It's bondage. And when someone demands your emotional labor as the price of their affection, that's not connection, that's control, disguised in vulnerability, wrapped in sadness, delivered through sighs and silence instead of shouting. And that's what makes it so hard to name, because the moment you do, the moment you say, this feels manipulative, they'll look at you with wounded eyes and say, I can't believe you'd think that of me. And the guilt will flood your chest like a storm, but this time, let it pass. Because the truth is, empathy without boundaries becomes self-betrayal. You can love someone deeply and still refuse to be their emotional puppet. You can hold space without holding their entire identity. You can care without caving. Because your care isn't meant to be currency. You don't owe your silence to protect someone else's fragility. You don't owe your submission just because they don't know how to manage their own reactions. You owe yourself honesty. You owe yourself peace. You owe yourself the kind of love that doesn't ask you to disappear just to keep someone else from unraveling. So if you've been gaslit by sadness, manipulated by moods, guilted by the gravity of someone else's needs, you are not cold, you are not cruel, you are not broken. You are awakening to the truth that love can hold conflict, that real relationships make room for all of you, that you can walk away from emotional blackmail and still be a loving person. Because love doesn't trap, it doesn't guilt, it doesn't punish your boundaries, it listens, it adjusts, it respects. And if you haven't felt that in a while, maybe it's because you've been too busy keeping the peace for someone who never intended to share it with you. You can stop now, not loving them less, just loving yourself more. You think you're just passing time. A few minutes here, a few swipes there, a scroll through your feed while waiting in line, lying in bed, standing in the kitchen. You think it's harmless. A mental break, a bit of entertainment, a way to stay connected. But what if your feed is doing something else entirely? What if it's not just showing you the world, but shaping how you see it, shaping what you believe, shaping who you become? Because that little screen in your hand, it's not passive, it's not neutral, it's not random, it's engineered. And not just to keep you interested, but to keep you afraid. Because fear is profitable, fear is powerful, fear makes people predictable. And if they can predict you, they can control you. So the feed becomes a factory, a system, an assembly line of content designed to stimulate your nervous system just enough to keep you engaged, but not enough to make you walk away. That's the trick. You won't see it coming because it's dressed in stories, in headlines, in short videos with bold captions, in bite-sized content that makes your heart race just enough to trigger a spike of cortisol, and you keep scrolling. Not because you want to, but because your body has been trained to. The algorithm doesn't care what's true, it cares what you react to. And fear always gets a reaction. So it shows you more. More warnings, more scandals, more outrage, more reasons to stay vigilant, to stay angry, to stay on edge. And at first, it feels like awareness. You tell yourself, I'm just staying informed. I'm just seeing what's happening in the world. I need to know this. But after a while, it stops feeling like awareness. It starts feeling like anxiety, like helplessness, like dread. And you don't know when it started, but suddenly everything feels like a threat. Everyone feels like an enemy, everything feels urgent, even when nothing has actually changed. Because the feed didn't just inform you, it trained you. It trained you to expect danger, to normalize panic, to accept chaos as the default setting, and most importantly, it trained you to obey. Because the more overwhelmed you are, the easier you are to direct. When your nervous system is overloaded, you don't question, you comply. You don't discern, you react. You don't challenge, you follow. And suddenly your thoughts don't feel like your thoughts anymore. They feel like echoes, snippets, fragments of headlines and videos and outrage reels that got lodged in your subconscious without permission. And now, they guide your behavior. You hesitate before speaking because someone on the feed said that people like you should stay quiet. You doubt your dreams because the algorithm showed you 50 reasons why it's not realistic. You compare your life to carefully curated highlight reels and wonder what's wrong with you. That's not awareness. That's programming. And it's everywhere. It's in the ads that imply you're not enough. It's in the influencers who sell insecurity as self-care. It's in the news accounts that never show solutions, only spirals. It's in the way you feel after 10 minutes of scrolling. Heavier, anxious, drained, and yet addicted. Because the fear doesn't just trigger panic, it triggers dependence. Your nervous system starts to rely on the scroll for stimulation, and when you try to stop, you feel withdrawal, not because you're weak, because it was designed that way. This is not an accident. It's an intentional design. Because a population kept in fear is easier to manage, easier to manipulate, easier to distract. And distraction is the goal. Because if you're focused on the feed, you're not focused on your own power. You're not creating. You're not questioning. You're not connecting to your own truth. You're consuming, mindlessly, endlessly, obediently. But here's the most dangerous part. It doesn't feel like fear. It feels like normal life. Because the more time you spend inside the fear factory, the more you forget what peace feels like. You forget what silence feels like, what stillness feels like, what it's like to move through a day without emotional whiplash. You forget how to be with yourself without needing a new piece of content to fill the space. And that's when they've won. Because a mind that can't rest is a mind that can't rebel. A mind that's always reacting has no space to reflect. And a person who forgets how to reflect forgets how to remember who they are. But you can remember. You can reclaim your attention. You can start noticing what you're being fed and ask, who does this serve? You can feel the spike in your chest and choose not to scroll. You can be informed without being addicted. You can connect without being conditioned, but first you have to see the machine. You have to name it for what it is, a fear factory. One designed to keep you anxious, obedient, distracted. And the more you see it, the less it owns you. You start noticing the pattern. You start reclaiming your time. You start remembering what calm feels like, and when your nervous system remembers peace, true peace, it stops craving panic. It stops needing stimulation to feel alive. It stops mistaking fear for awareness. It starts coming home to stillness. And in that stillness, you hear your real voice again. Not the feed, not the fear, not the noise. You. And that's when the factory loses its power, because you're not just scrolling anymore. You're waking up. It always starts the same way. A small vibration, a flash of light, a red dot in the corner of your screen. It could be anything. A message, a like, an update, a sale. But your body responds before you even think. Your hand moves toward the phone. Your eyes dart. Your brain perks up like a dog hearing a familiar bell. That's the point. Because it's not just a notification. It's a neurological hook. A cue. A tiny command baked into the fabric of your day. And whether you realize it or not, every push notification is doing something deeper than alerting you. It's training you. Not just to check your phone. Not just to stay connected, but to obey. Obey what? The invisible rhythm of dopamine. The reward loops designed to keep you on the leash of anticipation. The micro hits of validation, urgency, and fear that condition your mind to stay reactive and never rest. You're not addicted to your phone. You're addicted to the feeling your phone gives you, that quick jolt, that momentary buzz, that flicker of maybe something exciting is waiting for me. And it happens dozens, maybe hundreds of times a day. Every ping is a slot machine pull, and even when the result is meaningless, your brain releases a tiny dose of dopamine just for checking, because checking itself becomes the reward. You don't even need a good reason anymore. You check out of habit. You check without thinking. You check in the middle of conversations, while watching movies, even during moments of supposed stillness. Because the part of your brain that once scanned the environment for real danger and opportunity is now wired to scan your phone. And the people who design those notifications, they know this. They understand that attention is the most valuable currency in the world. And they want yours. All of it. So they use the oldest psychological trick in the book. intermittent reinforcement. Sometimes the notification gives you something exciting, sometimes it's nothing, sometimes it's urgent, sometimes it's irrelevant. But you keep checking, because your brain doesn't crave certainty, it craves the possibility of reward. Just like a rat in a lab pressing a lever, not knowing when the pellet will come. And the more you press, the more the behavior is reinforced. You start associating that buzz with significance, that ding with dopamine, that flash with importance, even when it's not. And here's where it gets darker. Because the more you respond, the more the system learns. It starts to time notifications for maximum effect. When your focus dips, when you're about to do something meaningful, when you've been quiet for too long. Ping, ping, ping. And there it is again, an interruption disguised as connection. But make no mistake, it's not connecting you, it's controlling you. It's fragmenting your attention, it's shortening your focus. It's training your brain to expect stimulation every few seconds. So when it doesn't come, you feel restless, anxious, bored. Not because you have nothing to do, but because your nervous system has forgotten how to be still. And that's not a glitch, it's the business model. Because a fragmented mind is an easy mind to sell to. A distracted mind is an easy mind to direct. A constantly interrupted mind becomes incapable of deep thought, deep feeling, deep anything. And so you live in a loop. Ping, check, tiny hit, return, ping again. Each time a bit of your attention is shaved off. Each time a bit of your autonomy slips away. Until one day, you're not choosing what you focus on anymore. You're reacting to whatever the system tells you to, and that's the real trap. Because the notifications don't just condition your brain, they colonize it. They invade your silence. They rupture your rituals. They pull you out of presence and back into the current of someone else's agenda. You don't even get to decide when you think anymore. Because your thoughts are constantly being interrupted, redirected, rewired. And the cost? Your creativity, your intuition, your peace. Because those things live in the long stretches of undivided time, in the quiet places, in the sacred stillness that no longer exists in your daily life. Because something's always buzzing, always flashing, always demanding your response. And you comply, because you've been trained to. That's what this really is. Training. Not just habit, not just distraction. Conditioning. You've been conditioned to associate movement with meaning, noise with importance, disruption with urgency. But real life doesn't work that way. Real love doesn't ping you every 5 minutes. Real healing doesn't come in push notifications. Real purpose doesn't demand your attention with red badges and alert tones. It waits. It waits for you to unplug long enough to hear it. And that's what you've forgotten. That you can unplug, that you can opt out, that every ping is an invitation and you are allowed to say no. You don't have to check every time. You don't have to respond immediately. You don't have to let the buzz dictate your day. You can take your attention back. Because your attention is sacred. It's how you create, it's how you love. It's how you connect with the deeper intelligence that lives inside you, but only if you protect it. So let this be your reminder. Your phone is not a master. The notifications are not your gods. The algorithm is not your truth. You are not a rat in a lab. You are not a product to be managed. You are not here to be obedient to a screen. You are here to remember, to reclaim what was always yours. Your focus, your agency, your stillness, and from that stillness you will rise clear, unhooked, uninterrupted. You wake up and reach for your phone before your feet touch the floor. It's instinct now, automatic, and as your eyes adjust to the light, the first thing you see isn't a sunrise, it's a crisis, a tragedy, a warning, a headline that tells you something terrible is happening again. Maybe it's war. Maybe it's politics. Maybe it's a scandal, a disaster, a viral outrage. You don't even flinch anymore, because this is normal now. Crisis has become the background hum of modern life. But not because the world is more dangerous. Because you're being trained to see it that way. You're not just consuming news. You're being conditioned. conditioned to feel overwhelmed, conditioned to feel powerless, conditioned to believe that the world is collapsing and there's nothing you can do about it. That's the manufactured crisis loop. Not a series of unfortunate events, but a psychological mechanism engineered to keep you frozen, dysregulated, dependent. Because when your nervous system is in constant fight or flight, you become easier to influence. You stop asking deep questions. You stop pausing to reflect. You start reacting. And those reactions are valuable. To someone, to something, to the system that profits from your fear, your division, your despair. Every headline you see is a small hypnotic script. It's not just telling you what happened, it's telling you how to feel about it. It's telling you who to blame, who to hate, what to be afraid of. And repetition is the spell. See it once, it's a concern. See it twice, it's a theme. See it 100 times, it becomes reality. Not objective reality, but the version of reality your body believes in. Because your body doesn't know the difference between a real threat and a perceived one. It only knows how it feels. And if every day begins with fear, ends with fear, and is filled with fear in between, then eventually fear becomes your baseline. And when fear is the baseline, obedience becomes the default. You go along, you keep scrolling, you stay in the loop. Because at least if you're paying attention, you feel like you're doing something. But you're not. You're spiraling. Your sense of agency is quietly dissolving. Your hope is shrinking. Your vision of the future becomes narrower with each new disaster. And no one told you this was happening. Because it doesn't look like manipulation, it looks like staying informed. It looks like being responsible. It looks like just checking the news. But underneath the surface, your perception is being curated. Your attention is being harvested. Your emotions are being hijacked. And the loop continues. Every day a new crisis. Every day a new enemy. Every day another reason to stay inside your mind, paralyzed by the enormity of it all. And what you don't realize is that the loop never ends. Because it's not designed to end. Peace doesn't sell. Hope doesn't keep you scrolling. Unity doesn't drive engagement. Fear does. Chaos does. Crisis does. So the headlines will keep coming. Even when the story isn't new, it will be repackaged. Even when the danger has passed, the panic will remain. Even when the facts are unclear, the emotion will be loud. Because it's not about truth. It's about effect. And the effect is always the same. You lose touch with your own center. You forget what calm feels like. You forget what it's like to live in the present moment without bracing for the next emotional hit. And soon, you stop noticing yourself. You stop noticing that your joy feels out of reach, that your creativity feels dim, that your relationships feel tense, that your body is always buzzing but never at peace. Because you're not living anymore. You're reacting to the next story, the next fear, the next twist in the never-ending loop. And it becomes addictive. Not because you love the fear, but because your system starts to rely on it, on the adrenaline, on the distraction, on the illusion that knowing more is the same as doing something. But it's not. The loop doesn't want you to act, it wants you to consume. Because the longer you consume, the less you create. The longer you stay afraid, the less you question why. The longer you stay overwhelmed, the less likely you are to remember that you still have power. But you do. That power lives in your choice to step out of the loop. Not to ignore what's happening in the world, but to engage with it on your terms, to discern instead of absorb, to feel instead of react, to respond instead of spiral. Because when you choose presence over panic, the spell begins to break. You start to notice which stories are real and which are manufactured. You start to hear the voice beneath the noise. You start to remember what it feels like to think for yourself. And in that space, agency returns. You no longer check the headlines to see how you should feel today. You don't let the latest outrage dictate your nervous system. You don't start every morning with a flood of cortisol. You start it with clarity, with breath, with truth. Your truth, not theirs. and the loop can't touch you there, because you're no longer in it. You're watching it from the outside with perspective, with choice. And the moment you choose to unplug from the hypnotic rhythm of helplessness, you become dangerous. Not to yourself, but to the system that needs you disempowered. Because a calm, conscious human is a threat to the narrative. Because a focused, grounded mind cannot be steered. Because a heart rooted in presence sees through the illusion of endless crisis. And that's what the loop was designed to prevent. But it failed. Because here you are, awake, unfolding, remembering. You don't have to read every headline. You don't have to follow every twist. You don't have to drown in the cycle to prove you care. You can breathe. You can ground. You can act with wisdom, not reaction. And the world doesn't need more reactors. It needs more rememberers. Of peace, of clarity, of truth. And you are remembering now. It starts earlier than you remember. You're a child, watching your first commercial, and suddenly something is missing. Not from your home, but from you. A toy, a shirt, a snack with a shiny mascot, something that until 5 seconds ago you never knew existed. But now you need it. You tug on your parent's sleeve, point to the screen and say, "Can I have that?" And just like that, the program has begun. Not the one on the TV, the one in your mind. The slow, subtle training that links identity to acquisition. That teaches you who you are by what you wear, what you own, what you chase. Not because the items matter, but because they've been attached to belonging. And belonging is a primal need. You want to be included. You want to feel seen. You want to feel worthy. They know this. They study this. And they build an entire economy around it. You're not buying products. You're buying connection. You're buying symbols that say, "I am enough." But you're never told that directly, because if you were, you might question it. You might pause and ask, why do I believe this shirt or this car or this lifestyle makes me more valuable? Instead, they show you over and over again, in movies, in music, in ads that don't look like ads. Just lifestyles captured through glossy filters and catchy hooks. You see someone smiling, free, admired, dressed in just the right brand, holding just the right object. And part of you thinks, if I had that, maybe I'd feel like that too. That thought, unquestioned, becomes a belief. That belief, repeated, becomes a behavior. And that behavior? It becomes your identity. You start chasing versions of yourself you haven't met yet, ones shaped entirely by what you're told you lack. Not by what you truly value, not by what lights your soul, but by what someone else packaged and priced for your consumption. And they make it easy. They make it addictive, because it's not just about what you buy, it's about how you feel before and after the purchase. You're shown the hole, then you're sold the bandage. And for a moment it works. You feel the high, the validation, the illusion of enoughness. Until the next ad, the next trend, the next standard that shifts just far enough away to keep you reaching. That's not coincidence, that's strategy. The system isn't built on satisfaction, it's built on scarcity. A scarcity of worth, of beauty, of identity. Because if you ever truly felt whole, you'd stop buying. And they can't afford that. So they feed you new ideals. They change the rules mid-game. They whisper through every ad and influencer and harmless scroll. You're almost there, just one more purchase away. But you never arrive. Because the finish line keeps moving, and the more you chase it, the more exhausted you become, and yet the harder it is to stop. Because now it's not just about wanting things, it's about avoiding what it means if you don't have them. If you don't dress the part, if your phone isn't the latest model, if your home isn't aesthetic, if your life isn't shareable, what does that say about you? That fear, that subtle shame is the leash. It keeps you quiet, compliant, in the loop. You buy to fit in. You buy to keep up. You buy to silence the growing discomfort of never feeling enough. And even when you do question it, you still feel the pull. Because this isn't just economics. It's psychological warfare. It's a system that hijacks your insecurities and sells them back to you dressed as dreams. And it's not accidental, it's designed. Entire teams are paid to manipulate your attention, your desire, your self-concept. They run tests to see which colors make you click, which phrases make you buy, which triggers make you feel just insecure enough to need something new. And the longer you're exposed, the deeper it embeds, until you don't just buy things, you become what you buy. And if you try to break free, you're labeled difficult, weird, uncool, out of touch. But what if that label is your liberation? What if breaking free means remembering that belonging isn't something you buy, it's something you reclaim, that your worth was never meant to hang on the price tag of your clothes, that your beauty doesn't expire with the next algorithm, that your soul doesn't shrink because your shoes aren't trending. You were whole before they told you otherwise. You were radiant before they dimmed the lights and sold you their version of shine. And now you get to remember. You get to choose differently, to ask new questions, to pause before purchasing and ask, is this for me, or for the version of me they taught me to perform? Because there's nothing wrong with enjoying beauty, or fashion, or aesthetics. What matters is who's choosing. Is it your soul, or the fear of being left out? Is it your essence, or the algorithm? Is it your truth, or your programming? Only one of those will lead you home. The rest will keep you chasing, endlessly in a maze built on illusion. But you don't have to run anymore. You can stop. You can sit with the discomfort of not keeping up. You can sit with the silence they told you to fill with noise. And in that silence, something returns. Your sovereignty, your clarity, your self. The self that doesn't need to be sold anything to feel whole. The self that doesn't perform for likes. The self that remembers. You are not a product. You are not a profile. You are not a brand. You are a soul. And no system can sell that. You think you're making choices. You think you're in control of what you click, what you like, what you watch, what you buy. But long before your finger taps the screen, something else has already decided what you'll see, what you'll want, what kind of person you'll believe you are. The algorithm is not just a neutral stream of suggestions. It's an invisible mirror, one that reflects not who you are, but who it wants you to become. And the scariest part? It works. Because the algorithm doesn't guess, it learns. It watches everything. Not just the links you click, but how long you hover. Not just what you search, but what you almost type and delete. Not just what you follow, but what makes your pupils dilate, your thumb pause, your breath catch. Every gesture, every hesitation, every micro-behavior is data. And that data tells a story. Not the story you'd tell about yourself. The story your nervous system tells when it thinks no one is watching. The story of your cravings, your fears, your insecurities, your longing. And once the algorithm sees that story, it starts writing it for you. It starts feeding you content that nudges your identity in a specific direction, not based on who you are, but based on who it's profitable for you to become. Because this is no longer just about attention, it's about predictability. The more they can predict you, the easier you are to monetize. And the easiest way to predict you is to shape you. Not by force, but by pattern. They give you more of what you already react to, then a little more, then a little more, until the patterns deepen, until you're no longer choosing, you're responding. Your sense of self becomes a feedback loop. You see content that reflects a version of you, you engage, it reinforces. The algorithm doubles down, you start to believe this is who I am. But is it? Or is it who you've been trained to be? The truth is, identity is fluid. It evolves. It expands. It questions itself. But the algorithm doesn't want fluidity. It wants consistency. So it suppresses the parts of you that deviate, the parts that wonder, the parts that might one day stop scrolling. Because curiosity is unpredictable. But a persona locked into a pattern, that's easy to sell to. So the algorithm feeds your existing bias. It echoes your beliefs. It fuels your preferences. It boxes you into an ever-narrowing tunnel of content that slowly becomes your world. And the longer you stay in that tunnel, the harder it is to remember there's anything outside of it. You forget how to be surprised. You forget how to question. You forget how to discover parts of yourself, not pre-approved by a machine. This isn't personalization, it's domestication. It trains you not just to engage, but to become what's most clickable about you, and slowly your soul becomes an algorithmic profile. It starts to think in hashtags, to express in template, to perform instead of explore. You wake up one day and realize your thoughts feel borrowed, your opinions feel recycled, your sense of self feels strangely automated. That's the cost of predictive design. It makes you feel seen, but only the part of you that's already known, already measured, already defined. And what happens to the rest? The parts of you that are still becoming, still raw, still sacred in their unmarketed form? They get silenced, buried under the flood of content that says, this is what you are, this is what you like, this is how you think, and maybe you even like what it gives you. It feels easy, familiar, comforting. Until one day it doesn't. Until one day you feel the quiet ache of your own untapped potential, the soft grief of not recognizing yourself, the nagging question, who am I outside this feed? And the silence that follows is deafening, because when you remove the algorithm, you're left with a mirror, a real one, and maybe that mirror doesn't have clear answers. Maybe it reflects your questions instead. But that's where truth begins. In the space where identity isn't predicted, it's discovered. Where you remember that you are not a sum of your likes. That your consciousness is not content. That your soul cannot be quantified. And in that remembering, you begin to choose again. Not based on what's suggested, but based on what resonates. You turn off autoplay. You stop scrolling when it hurts. You sit in the discomfort of not knowing what's next, and slowly you reclaim your attention, because attention is sacred, and where it goes, your identity follows. So guard it, not with fear, but with presence, because when you start choosing from presence, the algorithm loses its grip. It can't predict the unpredictable, it can't control what's conscious, it can't define what you haven't yet defined for yourself. And in that space you begin again, not as data, not as a consumer, but as a becoming, a sovereign self, unhooked, unfolding, unwritten. You don't even notice when it starts. Maybe it's the way you lower your voice around certain people, or the way you second-guess every word before you say it. Maybe it's the clothes you wear, the hobbies you hide, the dreams you shrink, not because someone told you to, but because something inside whispered, that's not safe. You think it's maturity, politeness, being realistic, but it's not. It's the echo of someone else's control now living inside your own body. The most insidious manipulation doesn't come from the outside, it's the one you begin to enforce on yourself. Because at some point, they didn't need to convince you anymore. You started doing it for them. You became your own captor. Not with chains, not with threats, but with self-policing so subtle, so quiet, you mistook it for your own voice. And that's what makes it so heartbreaking. You think you're making choices. You think you're protecting yourself. You think you're being wise. But what you're really doing is repeating the rules they taught you. Rules like, don't be too much. Don't speak unless you're sure. Don't ask for what you really want, it's too selfish. Don't rest. You haven't earned it. Don't cry. It makes you weak. Don't shine. It makes others uncomfortable. And you obey. Not because it feels good, but because somewhere along the way, survival got wired to submission. So you play small. You say yes when you want to scream no. You apologize for existing too loudly. You call it being agreeable. But it's not agreement, it's conditioning. You were taught to abandon yourself to stay acceptable, to perform instead of express, to shrink instead of shine. And you internalized it so deeply that now, when the external pressure disappears, the internal voice continues. Don't you dare. Don't speak. Don't move. Don't disrupt. And if you do, that voice reminds you of everything you risk. Rejection, judgment, being seen as difficult, being too much. So you self-correct. You self-censor. You become your own enforcer, making sure you never cross the invisible lines someone else drew long ago. That's the tragedy. They don't even have to be present anymore. Because you carry them with you. In your hesitation, in your guilt, in the way you feel shame for even thinking about wanting more. That's not a life. That's a sentence. And the saddest part, you don't even know you're in the cell. Because you built it brick by brick, thinking it would keep you safe. But safety isn't the same as freedom. Safety says, don't take up space. Freedom says, you belong here. Safety says, don't feel that, it's dangerous. Freedom says, feel everything, it's human. Safety says, stay predictable. Freedom says, evolve. But you forgot how to evolve. Because evolving would mean breaking the rules, and breaking the rules would mean confronting the part of you that still believes. They were right about me. The ones who criticized your softness, your fire, your sensitivity, your ambition, your truth. The ones who made you feel like love was conditional, and now you uphold those conditions every day, without realizing it. You don't chase what you want. You don't rest when you're tired. You don't speak when you disagree. You don't create what calls to you, because a long time ago someone taught you that freedom had a price. And that price was love. Belonging, being chosen. So now, even when no one's watching, you still live like someone might leave if you step too far out of line. That's how deep it goes. That's how masterfully they installed the program. So masterfully that now it doesn't feel like oppression. It feels like personality. You say, I'm just shy. I'm just anxious. I'm just not that kind of person. But who taught you that? Who told you that your real self was too much? That your truth was too risky? That your power needed to be managed? And more importantly, why are you still listening? Because here's what they never wanted you to realize. Every time you silence yourself, you're not keeping the peace. You're keeping the prison. Every time you dim your light to make someone else comfortable, you're feeding the lie that you must be smaller to be safe. Every time you hesitate, you reinforce the bars that no longer exist, except in your mind. But bars in the mind are still bars, and until you question them, you will remain both prisoner and guard. But you can question them now. You can look that inner voice in the eye, the one that mimics their tone, their criticism, their doubt, and say, you are not mine. You are a voice I inherited, a script I was handed, a fear that was never truly mine to carry. And I am done carrying it, because your nervous system can unlearn, your identity can unwrite, your soul can return. But only if you stop playing both roles. Only if you lay down the whip you've been holding to your own back. Only if you give yourself the permission they never did. Tormented. Permission to speak, to want, to rest, to expand. You are not too much. You were just raised in environments that couldn't hold your fullness. You are not broken. You are bruised from years of bending into shapes that were never yours. And now, you are waking up to the realization that freedom was never out there. It's always been here, inside, waiting for the moment you finally say, I don't need your rules. I don't need your voice in my head. I don't need your approval to be whole. I only need truth, and that truth is this. I am not here to be my own captor. I am here to be free. You know the voice. It doesn't shout. It doesn't need to. It waits, patient, familiar. It shows up when you pause long enough to hear yourself. It speaks in sharp certainty and cold precision. and it always knows where to strike. That was stupid. Why would you say that? Everyone sees how much of a mess you are. You'll never be enough. You call it your inner critic, but let's be honest, it doesn't sound like you, not the real you, not the one that loves, that dreams, that reaches toward life with open palms. This voice is different. It's older, colder, scripted, and that's because it is a script, a learned one, passed down, installed. You weren't born doubting yourself. You didn't arrive in this world with shame stitched into your spirit. You were taught through repetition, taught through tone, taught through subtle corrections and not so subtle punishments. Maybe it came from a parent, a teacher, a sibling, a society. Someone whose words carried authority long before you had the power to question them. And at first it was just noise outside of you. But you heard it enough, and with enough emotion, that it began to sink in, not just into your mind, but into your identity. And slowly that outside voice became an inner one. Now it speaks with your tongue. It uses your memories. It echoes inside your chest like it belongs there. But it doesn't. It was placed. Like a recording on loop, it plays the same lines over and over again. You're not good enough. You should be better by now. No one will really love you if they knew. You're falling behind. You're too much. You're not enough. Different words for different people. But the effect is always the same. You shrink. You hide. You self-sabotage before someone else can. You criticize yourself before the world has the chance. You think it's protection. You think it's self-awareness. You think it's truth. But that voice is not telling the truth. It's repeating a story. And the most tragic part? You believe it. Because it sounds like you. Because it uses your memories. Because it speaks with such conviction that you don't stop to ask, wait, who gave this voice a microphone? Because that's what it really is. A puppet. A character playing the role of you. A defense mechanism dressed as self-acknowledge. It doesn't want you to grow, it wants you to survive, and for a long time survival meant fitting in, it meant pleasing. It meant staying quiet, staying agreeable, staying inside the lines drawn by other people's discomfort. And now, every time you try to expand, that voice snaps back. Nope. Too risky, too loud, too honest, too exposed. It isn't trying to ruin your life, it's trying to keep you safe in the only way it knows how, by keeping you small. Because small felt safe once. Small kept you from being targeted. Small kept the love from being withdrawn. Small meant fewer mistakes, fewer confrontations, fewer consequences. But now it just keeps you invisible, trapped, muted. And you start mistaking that muting for maturity. You call it humility. You call it being realistic. You say, I'm just hard on myself because I want to improve. But improvement doesn't come from shame. It comes from compassion. And that voice doesn't speak compassion, it speaks control. Control inherited from a time when you had no power. Control rooted in fear masked as discipline. And if you never stop to question it, it runs your life. You'll avoid things you're called to do. You'll sabotage the good that shows up. You'll apologize for taking up space in rooms you were born to walk through, not because you're weak, because you were programmed. And programming can feel like personality if you're not careful. But here's what they never told you. You don't have to keep reciting the script. You don't have to keep letting that inner critic hold the mic. You don't have to keep mistaking that voice for truth, just because it's been there the longest. You can trace it. You can say, wait. That voice sounds like my father. That line came from a teacher in 6th grade. That tone, that's my ex. That fear, that's society's voice, not mine. And once you see it for what it is, a voice borrowed, not born, you start to take your power back. You start to notice when the script plays and choose not to follow it. You start to speak over it, to challenge it, to replace it, not with toxic positivity, but with truth. Because the truth is, you are not failing. You are forging. You are not behind. You are becoming. You are not too much. You are finally full. And yes, it takes time, it takes gentleness, it takes repetition in the opposite direction. But you're not alone anymore. You have a deeper voice, quiet, yes, but steady. The voice that knows who you were before the world told you who to be. The voice of your knowing, your essence, your soul. And that voice doesn't scream, it doesn't shame, it doesn't speak in ultimatums. It whispers. You're doing better than you think. You're not broken. You're blooming. You don't need to earn love. It lives in you. You're not late. You're right on time. And with each moment of listening, the critic softens. The script fades. The silence returns, and in that silence you meet yourself again. Not the puppet, not the echo. You. The real voice, the true voice, the only one worth believing. You say you want change, you dream about it, you journal about it, you talk about how things have to be different, how you're ready to grow, to rise, to finally step into who you know you're meant to be. But when the moment comes, when the choice is in front of you, real and trembling, something inside pulls back. It hesitates. Not because the path ahead is wrong, but because the path ahead is unknown. And the unknown feels like danger, even when the known is suffocating you. So you stay. You stay in the job that drains your soul. You stay in the relationship that makes you shrink. You stay in the patterns that numb your spirit. You stay in the identity that no longer fits, because at least it's familiar. And that's the paradox. You resist change, even when staying the same is costing you everything. Why? Because conformity is comfortable. Not in the way a soft bed is comfortable, but in the way a cage can become a home when you've been in it long enough. You get used to the bars. You stop noticing how small the space has become. You convince yourself this is just how life is. And slowly, you stop reaching for more. Because reaching would mean risking. And risk threatens the illusion of safety you've built from predictability. You tell yourself, I'll do it when I'm ready, when I have more time, more money, more clarity, more support. But what you're really waiting for is permission to break a rule you were never meant to follow. A rule like, don't stand out. Don't outgrow the people around you. Don't make others uncomfortable with your transformation. Don't disrupt the version of you they're used to. And so, conformity becomes an emotional contract. You trade your freedom for approval, your authenticity for acceptance, your becoming for the illusion of belonging, because belonging, real or not, feels like survival. And somewhere deep in your wiring, the idea of being cast out, of being too different, still lights up the same fear as physical danger. So you stay quiet, you stay still, you stay small, and you call it being practical, being polite, being realistic. But you know something sacred is decaying in the corner of your soul. You know something inside is aching to stretch, to speak, to shed its skin. And the more you ignore it, the more disconnected you feel from your own life. Because you're not meant to fit in, you're meant to become. And becoming is messy. It challenges the roles you've been assigned. It threatens the comfort of those who expect you to stay the same. It disrupts the social choreography that keeps a very one in their place. But evolution is disruption, and conformity is a slow death masquerading as peace. Because peace isn't the absence of discomfort, it's the presence of truth. And the truth is, most of what you cling to for comfort is the very thing keeping you stuck. The routines that numb, the people who drain, the stories that limit, the labels that confine. And the longer you stay in them, the more you forget what freedom feels like. You forget what it's like to wake up with wonder, to try something without a script, to speak from your gut instead of from your programming, to live instead of just manage your existence. But change requires a grief most people aren't willing to feel. The grief of who you thought you had to be. The grief of the relationships that only loved your past self. The grief of the life you built on the foundation of fear. And grief is uncomfortable. So you choose the pain you know over the freedom you don't. You keep living inside the image others have of you, because stepping out would mean confronting the silence that waits when you no longer play the part. But in that silence is your power, because silence is where your real voice lives, not the one molded by expectation, the one born from essence, the one that says, "This isn't me anymore. I don't belong here. I'm ready to go." And that voice doesn't scream. It doesn't beg. It simply waits. For the moment you get tired of the lie, tired of pretending, tired of the version of comfort that asks you to abandon yourself. And when that moment comes, everything shifts. Not all at once, not with fireworks, but with a quiet, internal yes. Yes to the unknown. Yes to the unraveling. Yes to the risk of being seen. Fully. Because being seen requires difference. It requires disruption. It requires letting go of who you were told to be. And that's terrifying. But it's also liberation. Because the comfort of conformity is shallow. It disappears the moment you try to evolve. Real comfort, the kind your soul longs for, is born from congruence, from living in alignment with what you really are, even if it costs you fitting in, even if it costs you approval, even if it costs you every mask you've ever worn to be accepted, because what you gain in return is truth, and truth will always be worth the risk. So if you're feeling the resistance, don't shame yourself. It means you're right on the edge. It means your old self is shaking. It means your nervous system is saying, "Wait, are we really doing this?" Yes, you are. You are allowed to outgrow. You are allowed to shift. You are allowed to want more, even if no one else understands why. You don't owe anyone your stagnation just to make them feel comfortable. You don't have to stay in the old story just because you know how it ends. You are not here to play a role. You are here to rewrite the script. And rewriting starts with refusal. The refusal to keep choosing a life that fits, but does not free you. Because freedom isn't found in keeping things familiar. It's found in walking toward the unfamiliar, with a heart that whispers, "I might not know exactly who I am becoming, but I know I can't stay here." You wake up and think you're making decisions. What to wear, what to eat, what to say, what to believe. You move through the day checking boxes, choosing options, picking between brands, preferences, posts, and with each one you reinforce a deep and quiet belief. This is my life. These are my choices. I am in control. But are you? Or is that just the illusion you've been conditioned to protect? Because here's the truth no one wants to say out loud. Most of what you call choice isn't freedom. It's programming. It's the result of countless invisible forces sculpting your perception long before you ever called it your own. Your thoughts are not isolated. Your opinions aren't independent. Your preferences didn't form in a vacuum. They were shaped by repetition, by exposure, by reward and punishment systems built into your childhood, your media, your culture, your family, your very biology. From the moment you could interpret the world, it was already interpreting you. You were handed beliefs, you were fed stories, you were told what's normal, what's dangerous, what's good, what's shameful, and then you were rewarded when you agreed, not because it was right, but because it was safe. So you learnt to comply, and over time compliance began to feel like identity. You didn't just learn what to think, you learned how to think, what to question, and more importantly, what not to. You learnt the shape of approval, the tone of disapproval, the subtle signs that told you when you were stepping too far outside the acceptable. And slowly, without noticing, your range of choice narrowed, not because someone took your freedom by force, but because they never let you develop it. Because real free will requires inner space. It requires awareness. It requires the painful, messy process of unlearning everything that was installed without your consent. And most people never get there. Most people live inside a script so well rehearsed they've mistaken it for their own voice. They chased success because they were told that's where happiness lives. They crave beauty because they were taught that's where worth hides. They pursue approval because their nervous system still believes that rejection equals death, and they call it choice. But it's not. It's a maze built from suggestion, from stories so old they've hardened into instinct, and the walls of that maze are lined with comforting lies. You're in control. You can be anything you want. Just follow your passion. Just trust yourself. But which part of you is doing the trusting? The real you, or the version shaped by advertising algorithms, cultural narratives, and the deep-seated fear of not being enough? This is the great seduction of modern life, to keep you busy with choices so you never realize how few of them are truly yours. You get to pick your clothes, your playlists, your favorite emoji, but you don't stop to ask who taught you what matters, who taught you what success means, what failure looks like, what kind of body is lovable, what kind of life is admirable, what kind of you is allowed to exist. Because if you did, you'd start to see the strings. And once you see the strings, the whole game changes. You realize your decisions are often just echoes of people who never had your best interest at heart, echoes of systems that profit from your obedience, echoes of trauma responses you mistook for personality traits. And when you finally hear those echoes for what they are, you begin to ask dangerous questions. What do I believe if no one's telling me what I should? What do I want if I'm not trying to impress anyone? Who am I beneath the noise? And that's where free will begins. Not in choosing between two options handed to you, but in realizing you were always allowed to step out of the frame entirely, to stop performing, to stop pretending, to stop making decisions based on survival when you were meant to choose based on truth. But the system doesn't want that. Because if you really had free will, you wouldn't buy things you don't need. You wouldn't work jobs that destroy your health. You wouldn't chase status that empties your soul. You'd stop being predictable, and predictable people are easy to control. So instead, the illusion must be protected. You're told that more options mean more freedom, that more content means more truth, that more control over your image means more identity. But freedom is not found in having more choices. It's found in knowing why you're choosing anything at all. And truth is not loud, it's not advertised. It doesn't come with a dopamine hit or a comment section full of affirmation. It comes in silence. It comes in discomfort. It comes when you step back from the rush of decisions and ask, what part of me is making this choice? Is it the wound? The fear? The inherited belief I've never questioned? Or is it the deeper part? The one I've ignored because it whispers instead of screams? That voice won't give you a list of goals. It won't offer a 10-step plan. It won't reward your obedience. But it will give you back your sovereignty. It will help you see that most of what you've called freedom was really just permission to stay within acceptable limits. That most of your identity was built from the outside in, and that beneath it all, there is a version of you who knows how to choose. Not to please, not to perform, but to live, to choose based on resonance, not repetition, to choose based on essence, not expectation. That's the beginning of true free will. And it's terrifying. Because once you see the illusion, you can't go back. You can't unhear the silence. You can't unknow what it cost you to stay asleep. You can't keep calling the cage a home just because the door was always open. So now, you're faced with a choice. A real one. Not between two brands, two paths, two identities that were handed to you like costumes, but between the life you were programmed to live and the one that's still waiting for you to choose it. Not perfectly, not quickly, but consciously. And in that consciousness, you are free. It never starts with a grand revelation. There's no lightning bolt, no booming voice from the sky, no cinematic turning point that announces, now you're waking up. It begins quieter than that. It begins with doubt, a subtle hesitation, a tiny discomfort in your chest when you hear something you've always accepted as truth, a pause, brief but undeniable, when someone says, "That's just the way it is," and something in you whispers, "Is it?" That whisper is the seed of your awakening. Not the kind of awakening they sell in slogans or attached to glamorous imagery, not the one where everything feels suddenly beautiful, but the raw, confusing, disorienting kind, the one that doesn't look like freedom at first, because it starts by dismantling what you thought was real. You begin to notice the cracks in the stories you've lived by, in the roles you've played so well, in the beliefs that once made you feel safe but now just feel hollow. You start to see the script, and more importantly, you start to wonder, who wrote this? Who told you what success should look like? Who convinced you that worth is something you earn, not something you already are? Who planted the fear that if you stop performing, you'll disappear? You don't have the answers yet, but you're asking, and that matters more than you know, because asking is dangerous, not to you, but to the illusion that's kept you asleep. The illusion of certainty, the illusion of control, the illusion that you've been choosing your life all along. And doubt is the match that burns it down. That's why the systems around you work so hard to demonize it. They'll tell you that doubt is weakness, that questioning is rebellion, that not knowing is failure. But here's the truth. Doubt is sacred. It's not the enemy of truth, it's the doorway to it. Because until you doubt, you're just repeating what you've been told, repeating what feels safe, repeating the version of you that was never yours to begin with. But the moment you say, "What if they're wrong?" you start to remember who you were before the world told you who to be. You start to unhook from the conditioning, from the noise, from the voices that never spoke in your best interest. And it's messy, because the first thing doubt kills is comfort. You stop being able to lie to yourself. You stop being able to pretend it's working. You stop being able to settle for the life you know isn't yours. But you haven't yet built the new one, so you float, in between, in the liminal space where everything feels uncertain and nothing feels solid. This is the wilderness of awakening, and it's where most people turn back. Because certainty, no matter how false, feels safer than not knowing. And doubt feels like losing your grip. But what you're really losing is the illusion. You're shedding the persona prosperity, the programming, the protective armor that kept you small enough to be accepted. And yes, it hurts. But that pain is not a sign you're broken. It's a sign you're breaking free. And with each question you ask, the fog clears just a little more. You begin to see how many of your thoughts were inherited, how many of your habits were reactions, how many of your relationships were built on silence and sacrifice. You begin to see the world not as it was sold to you, but as it is. Not filtered through fear or approval or shame, but through presence. You begin to hear your own voice again, faint at first, shaky, uncertain, but real. And that's all it needs to be. Because awakening isn't about having all the answers. It's about asking better questions. It's about honoring the discomfort instead of running from it. It's about choosing truth over image. It's about letting go over and over again of anything that asks you to betray your own knowing, even when it's hard, especially when it's hard. Because every time you honor that doubt, you come home to yourself a little more. You stop outsourcing your truth. You stop seeking permission. You stop needing validation to feel real. And slowly the foundation begins to rebuild, not on the approval of others, not on societal blueprints, but on clarity, on consciousness, on what actually resonates in your body, not just your mind. And that's when things begin to shift. You start saying no to what once held you captive. You start walking away from what once felt like obligation. You stop playing the game entirely. And it's not because you hate the world. It's because you finally remembered you don't belong to it. You were never here to conform. You were never here to sleepwalk through roles. You were never here to repeat patterns and call it life. You were here to wake up. And doubt was your alarm clock. That moment, the one you wanted to ignore, the one that shook something deep inside, that was the beginning, and it's only the beginning. Because now, every time something feels off, you'll pause. You'll feel it. You'll ask. You'll listen. And in that listening, you'll reclaim your reality, not the one built for you, the one you're building from within. And piece by piece, you'll come alive again, not because you found all the answers, but because you stopped being afraid of the questions. It doesn't always look like a revolution. Sometimes it's the quietest act in the room that shakes the system to its core. You might not shout. You might not march. You might not tear anything down with fire or fury, but one day you choose not to smile when you don't mean it. And that is rebellion. You pause before saying yes out of guilt and say no instead. And that is rebellion. You catch yourself repeating a pattern that never served you and you stop halfway through. That is rebellion. You don't announce it, no one congratulates you, there's no spotlight, no award, no round of applause. But your nervous system notices. Your soul notices. Because these are the silent victories, the micro-rebellions that begin to reclaim your life from the script you never agreed to write. The moment you stop apologizing for your existence. The moment you let yourself rest without guilt. The moment you speak truth even when your voice shakes. These are small, insignificant maybe to the outside world, but to the system, they are cracks in the wall, tiny fissures in the illusion of control. Because systems thrive on your autopilot, they depend on your obedience, not by force, but by habit. They teach you to move quietly through life, questioning nothing, to wake, work, perform, consume, sleep, repeat, without asking why. And every time you interrupt that cycle with a breath, a pause, a moment of awareness, you break the rhythm. You break their rhythm. And you begin to remember your own pace, your own truth, your own desires, not shaped by guilt or fear or false duty, but by choice. That's what a micro-rebellion really is. A choice. To choose yourself in a system designed to distract you from who you are. To choose presence in a world addicted to performance. To choose truth in an environment built on noise. And it begins in the smallest places. You notice the tightness in your chest before you agree to something. You pause, you breathe, and in that breath, you realize you don't want to say yes just to be liked. So you don't. No speech, no justification, just a simple, that doesn't feel right. That one sentence unravels years of social programming because it says, I trust my inner signal more than I fear your disapproval. And that's no small thing. For maybe one morning, you look in the mirror and choose not to criticize your reflection. You catch the usual insult before it leaves your lips. You replace it, not with forced praise, but with silence, with neutrality, with non-violence. That's a rebellion too. You choose a meal that nourishes instead of punishes. You walk because it brings you peace, not because it burns enough calories. You let yourself play. You let yourself create without demanding it be perfect. All of it counts. Every time you soften where you used to harden, that is power. Every time you forgive yourself for being human, that is power. Every time you decide to love without a mask, even if it terrifies you, that is power. Because the system doesn't fear loudness, it's used to loudness. It knows how to drown that out. But it doesn't know what to do with stillness, with softness, with people who no longer play the part but live from the core, people who have nothing to prove. And when you become one of them, even quietly, you're dangerous in the most beautiful way. You become a mirror to everyone still asleep, to everyone still fighting themselves, to everyone who forgot that life can feel like this, slow, intentional, unapologetic. You don't need to scream your rebellion, you just need to live it. By noticing the thought before it becomes a self-attack, the impulse before it becomes a people-pleasing yes, the craving before it becomes another numbing scroll. That noticing is awareness, and awareness is a crack in the system, Because awareness creates space, and in that space you remember. You have a choice. Not a reaction, not a default, a choice. And the moment you choose differently, everything shifts. Not instantly, not dramatically, but deeply. Because these small acts, they stack. One honest no after another. One breath of compassion after another. One step away from the old narrative again and again and again. Until one day you look up and you're somewhere new. Not because you overhauled your entire life overnight, but because you kept choosing freedom, one moment at a time. One moment of awareness, one moment of rest, one moment of truth. You didn't need to scream, you just needed to stop whispering over yourself. And when enough of us do this, when enough people reclaim their agency not with force, but with awareness, the system begins to tremble. Because nothing scares control like people who no longer fear being fully themselves. So let your rebellion be quiet. Let it be sacred. Let it be as soft or as slow as you need it to be. Because the system was never built to withstand someone who sees through it. And every time you choose something real over something rehearsed, you prove that it never owned you. Not really. You've carried it for years. That quiet ache inside your chest. The sense that something is fundamentally wrong with you. Maybe you've never spoken it aloud. Maybe you have. But either way, the feeling lingers. Why am I like this? Why do I freeze when it matters most? Why do I shut down when I want to speak up? Why do I sabotage the good things? Why do I keep repeating the same pain, the same habits, the same cycles, even when I know better? And somewhere along the way you internalized the cruelest possible answer. Because I'm broken. Because there must be a flaw in you that others don't have. Because maybe you're just too sensitive, too scared, too needy, too something. Because despite all your trying, nothing seems to stick. Not the healing, not the advice, not the success, not the self-love. And so the shame grows roots. You become both the prisoner and the guard. You judge yourself for what you don't understand. You blame yourself for patterns that started long before you had language. You punish yourself for coping mechanisms that once kept you alive. But let me tell you something that could change everything. You are not broken. You were trained. Everything you think is wrong with you is actually what's right with a nervous system that adapted to survive. Your silence, learned. Your people-pleasing, learned. Your fear of confrontation, learned. Your tendency to overachieve, overanalyze, overgive, over-apologize, learned. You weren't born doubting yourself. You weren't born suppressing your needs. You weren't born believing that love had to be earned. You were trained by the world around you, by the way love was given or withheld, by the micro-reactions that told you which parts of yourself were safe to show and which needed to be hidden, by environments where being yourself came with a cost. And your body remembered. It learned which tones meant danger, which silences meant tension, which looks meant rejection, which behaviors got you connection, even if that connection was hollow. And those learnings became patterns, not because you're weak, but because your system is brilliant, because a child will do anything to feel safe, even if that means slicing off parts of themselves just to stay close to the people they depend on. And now those strategies live inside you, automatic, subconscious, deeply rooted, not because you chose them, but because you had no choice not to. So of course you freeze. Of course you shut down. Of course you try to control, avoid, perfect, pretend. Because at some point those things worked, and your body decided this is what keeps us alive. But here's the thing. You're not in that environment anymore. And what once protected you is now what's keeping you stuck. But you can't shame your way out of survival. You can't bully your nervous system into feeling safe. You have to understand it. You have to honor it. You have to say thank you for protecting me. But we don't need that armor anymore. That's not weakness. That's power. Because the moment you stop blaming yourself for the way you learned to survive, you create space to choose differently. Not out of fear, not out of shame, but from awareness. You start to notice when an old pattern wants to run the show, and you pause, you breathe, you ask, what am I trying to protect right now? And suddenly you're not a broken person reacting, you're a conscious being responding. That shift, that's the beginning of healing. Not fixing, not forcing. Just meeting yourself with enough gentleness to soften the walls. And maybe for the first time you realize that voice in your head saying, "You're too much," wasn't yours. That instinct to apologize for existing was taught. That fear of being seen wasn't born in you, it was given to you. But if it was learned, you can retrain the very patterns that once kept you small. You can show your nervous system that safety doesn't come from perfection, but from presence. That connection doesn't come from shrinking, but from truth. That worth doesn't have to be earned. It already is. And yes, it takes time. It takes patience. It takes repetition over and over, like untangling a knot that's been there for decades. But every moment you choose to stay present with yourself, especially when it's hard, is a thread loosened. Every time you catch the pattern and offer compassion instead of critique, another loop begins to dissolve. And slowly, the story changes, not into some fairy tale, but into something real. You still feel fear, but you don't let it choose for you. You still hear the old voices, but you don't believe them. You still have the scars, but you stop cutting yourself open to prove they are healed. You don't have to erase your past to be free from it. You just have to stop mistaking your trauma response for your identity. You just have to stop calling your brilliance a burden, your sensitivity a flaw, your coping mechanisms a personal failure. They're not. They're evidence of how hard you fought to stay alive in a world that taught you to abandon yourself. But you don't have to abandon yourself anymore. You get to return, to rebuild, to reparent, to rewire. Not into a better version of yourself, just a truer one. And that's what healing really is. Not becoming someone else, but becoming who you were before the world taught you to be afraid of your own light. You're not broken, you're becoming aware. And in that awareness lives the kind of power that can't be taken from you ever again. It doesn't start with a massive shift, it starts with a single moment, a single thought you catch before it catches you. You notice the voice, that familiar automatic whisper that says, "You can't, you shouldn't, you'll fail, don't bother." And instead of obeying it, like you've done so many times before, you pause. You don't silence it. You don't argue with it. You just notice. And in that noticing, something ancient and powerful happens. You create space between you and the thought. It's a split-second pause, but it's everything. Because that space is where freedom begins. Freedom doesn't come from escaping your thoughts. It comes from no longer believing all of them. And that's where the reclamation begins, not with conquering, but with curiosity. You start asking different questions. Who does this voice sound like? When did I first hear it? What does it want me to fear? What does it keep me from doing? And just like that, the script begins to unravel. Because most of your thoughts aren't yours. They're echoes, leftover programming, bits and fragments of stories planted by others, parents, teachers, media, partners, cultures, recycled so many times they started to sound like truth. But they were never your truth. You inherited them, you absorbed them, you repeated them until your brain built neural pathways around them, and now they feel automatic. But automatic doesn't mean accurate, it just means rehearsed. And your mind, brilliant and loyal as it is, will always favor the familiar over the liberating, until you teach it otherwise. That's the work. Not to fight your mind, but to befriend it. To understand that every thought, even the painful ones, is just your brain trying to keep you safe. But safe isn't the same as free. Safe is staying small. Safe is staying silent. Safe is not risking rejection, not telling the truth, not stepping out of line. Safe is the cage you've outgrown. And freedom Freedom is dangerous to the part of you that was trained to fear your own power. So reclaiming your mind is not just a spiritual practice, it's a revolution. It's choosing again and again to see your thoughts without letting them dictate who you are. You wake up and the first thought says, "You're already behind." Instead of obeying, you breathe. You say, "That's a thought, not a fact." You feel anxious and your brain says, "Something must be wrong." You say, "This is a sensation, not a prophecy." You mess up, and the old narrative starts. "You always do this. You're such a failure." You pause. You ask, "Who taught me that mistakes mean I'm worthless?" You begin to listen, not for truth, but for origin. Because once you know where a thought came from, you stop mistaking it for your identity. You begin to build a relationship with your inner landscape, not just reacting to every storm, but learning how to stand in it without being swept away. You become a witness, and a witness cannot be controlled. That's what makes awareness so powerful. It turns you from a puppet into a participant, and the more you notice, the more you interrupt the old momentum. You catch the self-hate loop before it spirals. You stop mid-sentence when you're about to minimize yourself. You hear the voice of fear trying to protect you from disappointment, and you say, "I know you're trying to help, but I'm not that fragile anymore." And each time you do that, you lay a new brick in the foundation of your autonomy, because your mind isn't a battleground. It's a territory waiting to be reclaimed, not through force, through presence, through repetition, through compassion, through tiny, almost invisible acts of defiance against the narrative that says you're not in control, because you are. Not all at once, not perfectly, but moment by moment. And in those moments you begin to rebuild. You choose thoughts that expand instead of shrink, that encourage instead of criticize, that speak from love instead of fear. Not because you're faking positivity, but because you're choosing alignment, because you're teaching your mind how to serve you instead of sabotage you. And the beautiful thing is, it learns. Neuroplasticity is real. Your brain rewires with repetition. So every time you choose a new response, even if it feels unnatural, you're carving a new path. And over time, those new paths become highways, and those highways become home. And suddenly, thoughts like, "I'm capable, I'm worthy, I'm allowed to rest, I don't have to earn love," don't feel like delusions, they feel like you, because you've made enough room for yourself to come back. That's what reclaiming your mind is. It's not about never having a negative thought again. It's about knowing that you are not your thoughts. You are the one who sees them, the one who chooses what to keep, what to question, what to rewrite. And in that choice, you're free. Because no one can control a mind that has remembered its own authority, not society, not fear, not shame, not the ghosts of who you used to be. Only you. One thought at a time. It doesn't always come in a moment of triumph. Sometimes it arrives when you're sitting in the dark, numb from trying, exhausted from pretending. You're not searching for clarity. You've almost stopped searching altogether. And then, out of nowhere, a single thought breaks through the noise. Not loud, not commanding, barely a whisper. But it feels different. It doesn't criticize you, it doesn't push you, it doesn't echo anyone else's voice. It just says, "This isn't who I am." And you pause. Not because you fully understand it, but because something deep inside does. Something beneath all the roles you've played, the masks you've worn, the rules you've followed. Something ancient. Something true. Something you. That thought, that tiny flicker of knowing, becomes the crack in the illusion. It doesn't come with fireworks. It doesn't need to. Because once it lands, it starts to echo. This isn't who I am. Not the way I silence myself, not the way I hustle for worth, not the way I fake my joy, perform my pain, swallow my truth just to keep the peace. Not the way I shrink around certain people, not the way I shapeshift to be more acceptable, not the way I trade authenticity for safety and call it love. And suddenly, you see You see how many times you've betrayed yourself just to be accepted? How many times you've smiled when you wanted to scream? How many times you've played roles you never auditioned for, just to feel needed, wanted, good enough? You see the cost, not just in your body, but in your soul. And the whisper grows louder. This isn't who I am. At first it shakes you, because you've spent so long being what the world wanted, what others needed, what your trauma allowed. You built a whole identity around survival. And now that identity is unraveling, piece by piece. It's terrifying. It's disorienting. It feels like losing your grip. But it's not a breakdown. It's a breakthrough. Because for the first time, you're not looking outside yourself for direction. You're listening inward. The part of you that never forgot. The part that stayed quiet because the world wasn't safe for your truth. The part that waited patiently until you were ready to hear. And now you are. You're ready not because you feel brave, but because staying silent finally became more painful than being seen. You can't unknow what you've seen. You can't unhear your own voice now that it's speaking. At the beginning. The thought that woke you up. It's not always poetic. Sometimes it's raw, even messy. I'm tired of pretending I can't do this anymore. I want more. This isn't working. I miss myself. But whatever the form, the feeling is the same. Something inside of you stands up. And from that moment on, even when you try to go back to sleep, you'll feel the dissonance. You'll hear the friction between who you are and who you've been performing. You'll notice the moments when your truth tightens your chest and catches in your throat, because you didn't speak it. You'll become sensitive to the ways you abandon yourself, not out of self-hate, but out of awakening. Because when you hear yourself clearly for the first time, the silence that follows is not empty. It's sacred. It's a space for reckoning, a space where you realize you were never lost. You were just buried, under expectation, under shame, under other people's projections of who you should be. And that whisper, that thought, it's the shovel in your hand. You begin to dig, not for answers, but for presence. You unearth the memories. You face the stories. You look at your patterns and say, I see you. I know why you're here. But you don't get to run the show anymore. You begin to parent yourself, to tend to your own wounds, to ask yourself before anyone else, what do I need right now? You stop chasing validation from those who benefit from your silence. You stop molding your light to fit into someone else's shadow, and as that whisper grows, it becomes something else. It becomes a roar. I am not broken. I am not small. I am not here to perform, to please, to disappear inside other people's comfort. You are here to remember what joy feels like when it's not curated, what peace feels like when it's not conditional, what truth feels like when it's spoken, not swallowed. You don't have to become someone new, you just have to stop pretending to be someone else. And that's what that first thought gave you, a key, a map, a voice, the reminder that you were never asleep because you were weak. You were asleep because you had to be, because the world wasn't ready, because the trauma wasn't processed, because the voice wasn't safe to speak yet. But it is now, and the beauty is, you don't have to yell it. You don't have to prove it. You don't have to fix everything overnight. You just have to keep listening. Keep trusting that whisper, because the more you follow it, the louder it gets, until one day you're no longer the echo of someone else's story, you're the author. And you'll look back and realize it all began with a single thought, the one that didn't shout, the one that didn't beg, the one that simply said, "This isn't who I am." And in that quiet clarity, you finally began to become.